My name is Harper Evans. I am 30 years old and I am a corporate accountant working grueling 60-hour weeks in Chicago. Show me exactly how you have managed your $5 million trust fund over the last 12 years. My grandfather spoke these precise words across the table at my birthday dinner. I sat completely frozen and whispered that I never received a single dime. Then his ruthless lawyer placed 40 pages of bank statements right on the pristine white tablecloth. The color instantly drained from my parents' faces, and they nearly collapsed. Before I explain how I systematically destroyed the fraudulent lives they built with my stolen money, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to fight back against the family that was supposed to protect you. The nightmare began an hour earlier on a rainy Friday evening. I was sitting at a high-end downtown steakhouse celebrating my 30th birthday. I was also secretly paying the massive bill for this dinner. For my entire adult life, my parents, William and Patricia, claimed they were drowning in crippling medical debt. They swore this debt came from a severe childhood illness. They constantly reminded me about an illness I barely even remembered having. Out of profound guilt and duty, I sacrificed my entire 20s. I lived in a tiny, moldy studio apartment eating cheap takeout while putting every spare penny toward their survival. I worked myself to the bone and sent them $2,000 every single month just to keep a roof over their heads. I literally bled my own finances dry to save them from ruin. I was actively checking my bank app under the table to make sure my credit card would clear the dinner check when my golden child sister Vanessa finally arrived. She was 45 minutes late and did not look the least bit sorry. She slid into the leather booth wearing a brand new custom silk dress. A $10,000 Cartier watch was gleaming brightly on her wrist. Instead of apologizing for her extreme tardiness or wishing me a happy birthday, she immediately began complaining about the terrible valet parking and the subpar wine selection. She waved her hand dismissively at our waiter, demanding a fresh glass of their most expensive vintage. I bit my tongue so hard I tasted blood in my mouth. I kept quiet because keeping the peace was the only role I was ever allowed to play in the Evans family. I swallowed my intense anger and focused on the leather-bound menu, telling myself it was just one dinner and I could easily survive it. But the fragile peace I was desperately trying to maintain was about to be completely obliterated. Just as the waiter returned with Vanessa's overpriced drink, the heavy oak doors of our private dining room forcefully swung open. The sudden noise cut through Vanessa complaining about her wine. Every head at the table turned toward the entrance. The waiter who had just arrived with the drinks froze completely still. Standing in the doorway was a man I had not seen in person since I was a very little girl. It was my grandfather Harrison. He was an incredibly wealthy oil tycoon who had spent my entire life living on an expansive estate in Europe. He moved to Switzerland decades ago, after a massive and explosive falling out with my father. I only knew his face from rare photographs and occasional holiday cards that my mother usually intercepted and threw away. But there was no mistaking him now. He wore an impeccably tailored dark suit and carried a polished wooden cane. His posture was rigid and commanding. He carried an aura of immense wealth and absolute authority that seemed to suck all the oxygen right out of the room. Flanking him was a man who looked like a legal executioner. He was tall and dressed in a sharp gray suit while carrying a thick leather briefcase. I would soon learn this was Mr. Sterling, my grandfather's personal estate attorney and a renowned legal shark. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. I watched my father's face transition from mild annoyance at the interruption to utter and complete terror. William gripped the edge of the dining table so hard, his knuckles turned stark white. Patricia, my mother, let out a sharp gasp and pressed her hand against her chest. Even Vanessa stopped talking, as her mouth snapped shut and she lowered her wine glass. Grandpa Harrison did not offer a warm family greeting. He did not say hello to his son. He did not even look at Patricia or Vanessa. He walked directly toward the head of the table. The waiter scrambled out of his way and practically ran out of the room before pulling the heavy doors shut behind him. The silence left behind was deafening. My grandfather pulled out a leather chair right next to me and sat down slowly. He placed his cane against the table. His sharp blue eyes locked onto mine. He looked at my cheap and worn-out blazer. He looked at my tired face. He did not look at the generic birthday cake sitting in the center of the table. He leaned forward and rested his hands on the white tablecloth. When he spoke, his voice was dangerously calm. It was the voice of a man who had commanded boardrooms and dismantled corporations. "Show me exactly how you have managed your $5 million trust fund over the last 12 years, he said. The words hung in the air like a physical weight. I stopped breathing. My brain, perfectly trained to process complex corporate financial data at lightning speed, completely stalled. $5 million, a trust fund. I stared at him while my heart hammered violently against my ribs. I thought it was some kind of cruel joke. I thought I had misunderstood him. I opened my mouth to answer, but my throat was completely dry. I glanced across the table at my parents. William was staring at his plate and refusing to make eye contact with me or his father. Patricia was shaking her head in tiny and rapid movements as a look of pure panic washed over her face. I turned back to my grandfather. I leaned in and whispered the only truth I knew. I have no idea what you are talking about. I never received a single dime. I do not have a trust fund. Grandpa Harrison did not look surprised. He looked utterly heartbroken, and then his expression hardened into pure and glacial rage. He did not say another word to me. He simply raised his right hand and snapped his fingers once. Mr. Sterling stepped forward from the shadows of the room. He unclasped his leather briefcase with a sharp metallic click that echoed loudly in the silent room. He pulled out a massive and densely bound stack of financial documents. It was easily 40 pages thick. With a swift and aggressive motion, Mr. Sterling slammed the massive financial ledger directly onto the center of the pristine white tablecloth. The heavy thud rattled the silverware. I am a corporate accountant. I spend 60 hours a week analyzing ledgers and auditing accounts and finding missing money for massive firms in Chicago. The moment that document hit the table, my professional instincts overrode my shock. I reached out with trembling hands and pulled the heavy stack of papers toward me. I flipped open the cover page. It was an official and certified banking ledger from a highly secure international trust firm. The beneficiary listed at the very top of the page in bold black ink was Harper Evans. That was my name. Below my name was the activation date. The trust had been fully activated 12 years ago on the exact day of my 18th birthday. I traced my finger down the first column of numbers as my accounting brain quickly decoded the data. The initial deposit was exactly $5 million. But the account balance was not $5 million anymore. I flipped to the second page. My eyes scanned the withdrawal columns. Every single month for the past 12 years, massive wire transfers had been executed. $10,000 here, $50,000 there. A lump sum withdrawal of $200,000 authorized on a random Tuesday in November. I flipped another page and my breath caught in my throat. I saw a massive transfer of $400,000 routed to an offshore limited liability company. Over 12 years, $4.8 million had been systematically and ruthlessly drained from my name. The account was virtually empty. I kept staring at the dates of the massive withdrawals, and suddenly a horrifying pattern emerged. The dates perfectly aligned with major milestones in my family. The $200,000 withdrawal happened the exact same week my parents mysteriously paid off the mortgage on their house. The massive $400,000 transfer happened the exact month Vanessa bought her luxury mansion, a purchase my parents claimed they helped fund by taking on extreme debt. Every luxury vacation they took, and every designer watch Vanessa wore, and every country club membership fee they bragged about perfectly matched the dates of the withdrawals from my stolen trust fund. While I was living in a moldy apartment and surviving on cheap noodles, and sending them $2,000 a month from my grueling accounting job to save them from a fabricated medical debt. They were living like royalty on my grandfather's money, the money he had secretly left for my future. They had forged my signature. They had stolen my identity. They had robbed me of my entire youth and actively watched me struggle and suffer while they drained millions in the shadows. A loud crash violently snapped my attention away from the ledger. My father had tried to reach for his water glass, but his hands were shaking so uncontrollably that he knocked over his expensive red wine. The delicate crystal glass shattered against the table. The dark red wine spilled out and bled rapidly across the stark white tablecloth before dripping onto his lap. He did not even try to clean it up. He just sat there, breathing heavily and staring at the shattered glass. I looked at my mother. Patricia had gone completely chalk white. All the color had vanished from her skin. Her jaw was slack, and her mouth was opening and closing like a fish out of water. But no sound was coming out. She looked terrified and trapped and completely exposed. Vanessa dropped her fork. It clattered loudly against her porcelain plate. She looked frantically between the massive ledger and my grandfather and our sweating parents. The immense superiority she had walked into the room with was entirely gone, and was replaced by a creeping, suffocating panic. I looked back down at the ledger and ran my fingers over the forged authorization signatures. 12 years of calculated deception. 12 years of absolute financial abuse. They had stolen $4.8 million from their own child. The intense heat of pure fury began to rise in my chest and burned away every ounce of loyalty I had ever felt for the people sitting across from me. The silence in the private dining room was so absolute that I could hear the rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. I stared at the shattered crystal and the dark red wine dripping onto the plush carpet. I expected my father to break down. I expected a confession. I expected William to fall to his knees and beg his father for forgiveness. But my father did not break. I watched a terrifying transformation take over his features. The initial sheer panic completely vanished. His shoulders relaxed. His posture straightened. The color slowly returned to his face. He pulled a crisp linen napkin from his lap and calmly wiped the spilled wine from his expensive trousers. He did not look at me. He looked directly across the table at my grandfather. When William finally spoke, his voice was not shaking. It was dripping with a heavy manufactured sorrow. He let out a long, trembling sigh that echoed in the quiet room. "I never wanted you to find out this way, Dad," he said. His tone was perfectly calibrated to sound like a heartbroken parent carrying an unbearable burden. We tried to handle it privately. We tried to protect the family name. I sat frozen. Protect the family name. What was he talking about? My grandfather narrowed his sharp blue eyes. Protect the family from what, William? You drained $4.8 million from her trust. You forged authorization forms. We had no choice, William replied smoothly. He folded his hands on the table and looked at my grandfather with wide, earnest eyes. Harper is very sick. She has been very sick for a long time. I opened my mouth to speak, but the sheer absurdity of the statement paralyzed my vocal cords. Sick. I worked 60 hours a week. I managed corporate accounts for major firms. I was the only responsible person in this entire family. William turned his gaze toward me, and his eyes were completely dead. There was no love, no guilt, no hesitation. Harper is a high-functioning gambling addict, he said. The words hit the center of the table like a live grenade. It started when she was 18. She got access to a small portion of the funds, and she lost it all in a matter of weeks on offshore betting sites and underground tables. She was spiraling out of control. She owed money to very dangerous people. They were threatening her life. My brain short-circuited. I did not gamble. I had never even bought a lottery ticket. I audited financial statements for a living. I tracked every single penny I earned in a meticulous spreadsheet. I lived in a moldy apartment because I was sending them $2,000 a month. The lie was so massive, so profoundly divorced from reality, that I actually let out a short, hysterical laugh. "That is insane!" I stammered, looking frantically at my grandfather, and then at the ruthless estate attorney. "That is an absolute lie. I have never gambled a day in my life. I am a corporate accountant. That is the tragedy of high-functioning addicts," Patricia chimed in. My mother leaned forward, placing a comforting hand on William's arm. She looked at my grandfather with tears glistening perfectly in her eyes. It was an Oscar-worthy performance. They know exactly how to hide it. Harper uses her accounting knowledge to mask her tracks. She manipulated the numbers. When we discovered the massive debt she had accrued by age 20, we were terrified. We stepped in to save her life. We legally acted as her financial conservators. We had to move the trust money into protected LLCs to keep her creditors from seizing the entire estate. The protected LLCs. She was talking about Vanny Corp, the shell company they used to buy Vanessa a luxury yacht and a multi-million-dollar mansion. They were taking the exact mechanism of their horrific financial fraud and weaponizing it against me. They were spinning their blatant theft into an act of parental sacrifice. Every dollar we withdrew. William continued, his voice thick with fake emotion, went directly towards saving our daughter. We sent her to the most exclusive private rehabilitation centers in the country. Facilities in Malibu, facilities in Switzerland. They require massive cash deposits to ensure total discretion and absolute privacy. That is where the money went, Dad. We drained our own savings too. We are drowning in debt because we refuse to let our daughter destroy herself. The medical debt. The crushing medical debt they claimed they had. The debt I had been working myself to the bone to pay off for them. They had just seamlessly woven my ultimate sacrifice into their disgusting narrative. It is true, Grandpa Vanessa said softly from across the table. My sister, the golden child, looked down at her hands, playing the role of the traumatized sibling to absolute perfection. It has been a nightmare for us. Harper would disappear for weeks at a time. She would steal from my purse. She would scream at Mom and Dad when they refused to give her more cash. They paid off her debts so she would not go to prison. They bought my house under a corporate name, just so Harper could not leverage it for gambling loans. We have all sacrificed everything to keep her safe. I looked at Vanessa's wrist. The $10,000 Cartier watch caught the ambient light of the restaurant. I bought that watch, I realized with sickening clarity. My stolen future bought that watch. Stop it! I cried out. My voice finally broke through the paralysis. I pushed my chair back and stood up. My hands were shaking so hard, I had to grip the edge of the table to stay upright. Grandpa, you cannot believe this. Look at me. Look at my apartment. Look at my tax returns. They are lying to you. They stole the money. They bought a yacht. They bought a mansion. I send them $2,000 a month for my own salary. I looked at Mr. Sterling, the attorney. You are a lawyer, I pleaded desperately. You can see the paper trail. You can see the offshore accounts. They forged my signature. William shook his head sadly. We did not forge anything. We have a legally binding power of attorney that Harper signed during her first major relapse. We have the medical records from the rehab facilities. We have a complete paper trail proving her gross incompetence and documenting every single intervention. We kept the records to protect ourselves because we knew her addiction would eventually make her turn against us. A paper trail. They had fabricated an entire paper trail. My parents had spent the last 12 years anticipating this exact moment. While they were routing my trust fund into shell accounts, they were simultaneously generating fake medical documents, fake power of attorney signatures, and fake rehabilitation invoices. They had built a perfectly constructed alternate reality designed to absolutely destroy my credibility if I ever discovered the truth. I turned to my grandfather. I needed him to see through the performance. I needed him to look at the daughter who had worked 60-hour weeks and recognize the truth. But when I looked into his eyes, my heart completely shattered. Grandpa Harrison was not looking at my parents with suspicion. He was looking at me with profound, agonizing disappointment. He was a man from a different generation, a man who believed in family honor and deeply feared public disgrace. The lie my parents told was custom-built for his specific vulnerabilities. A secret gambling addiction, exclusive private rehabs to avoid bringing shame to the family name, a rebellious granddaughter draining the family resources. It was exactly the kind of tragedy a wealthy patriarch would easily believe and desperately want to hide. Grandpa, please, I whispered. Tears were freely streaming down my face now. The injustice was so heavy it felt like it was crushing my lungs. I am an accountant. I work every single day. I do not gamble. They are stealing from me. They are stealing from you. Enough. Grandpa Harrison raised his hand. His voice was no longer commanding. It sounded incredibly old and incredibly tired. I have heard enough. He slowly pushed his chair back and stood up. He did not look at my parents. He kept his eyes locked on me, and the absolute disgust in his gaze felt like a physical blow to my stomach. I stayed away for 30 years because I thought your father was a greedy, manipulative fool, my grandfather said quietly. I bypassed him completely. I set up that trust specifically for you, Harper. I wanted you to have a life of complete independence. I wanted you to build something meaningful. Instead, you squandered millions on cheap thrills and forced your family to cover your disgraceful tracks. You have brought absolute shame to this family. No! I sobbed, reaching out toward him. You have to look at the bank statements. Please, just look at the routing numbers. I do not need to look at anything else, he interrupted sharply. He reached down and grabbed his polished wooden cane. You are exactly the kind of disappointment I feared you would become. You are lucky your parents did not let you rot in a gutter. He turned to his attorney. Mr. Sterling, gather the documents. We are leaving. I will not spend another second in the presence of this absolute disgrace. Mr. Sterling did not show any emotion. He was a professional. He simply nodded, reached across the white tablecloth, and smoothly gathered the 40-page financial ledger. He slipped it back into his leather briefcase and snapped the lock shut. The sound was deafening in the quiet room. It was the sound of my only salvation being locked away and carried out the door. I watched my grandfather turn his back on me. I watched him walk slowly toward the heavy oak doors. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tackle him to the floor and force him to listen to reason. But I was utterly paralyzed by the psychological warfare playing out in front of me. They had stolen my money, and now they had successfully stolen my only ally. The doors opened, and my grandfather walked out into the corridor. Mr. Sterling followed him without a single backward glance. The heavy doors swung shut behind them, sealing me inside the private dining room with my family. The second the latch clicked into place, the entire atmosphere in the room shifted. The manufactured sorrow completely vanished from my father's face. The fake tears instantly dried up in my mother's eyes. Vanessa stopped looking like a traumatized sister and leaned back against the leather booth, picking up her wine glass with a deeply satisfied smirk. The transformation was so immediate and so chilling that it literally made my blood run cold. I was no longer looking at my family. I was looking at a cartel. Patricia slowly stood up from her chair. She smoothed the front of her designer dress, completely unbothered by the fact that she had just permanently destroyed my relationship with my grandfather. She walked around the shattered crystal and the spilled wine on the floor. She stepped directly into my personal space. I was taller than her, but in that moment she seemed to completely tower over me. She leaned in close. I could smell the expensive perfume I had inadvertently bought her for Christmas using my meager savings. Her voice dropped to a vicious, venomous whisper that sent ice straight into my veins. "Listen to me very carefully, Harper," she hissed. Her eyes were completely devoid of any maternal warmth. "You will not breathe a single word of this to anyone. You will not call a lawyer. You will not try to contact your grandfather. You will walk out of this restaurant, you will go back to your pathetic little apartment, and you will keep your mouth completely shut." I stared at her, my breathing shallow and rapid. "You stole everything from me. You stole $5 million. We took what we were owed for raising such an ungrateful burden," William stated coldly from across the table. "You are never going to do anything useful with that kind of money anyway. We put it to good use. We built a real legacy." Patricia reached out and grabbed my forearm. Her perfectly manicured fingernails dug sharply into my skin. "If you try to fight us," she continued, her voice razor sharp, "we will completely destroy you. We were not lying about the paper trail. We have spent 12 years preparing for this exact day. We have doctors who will swear you are a pathological gambling addict. We have forged financial records that look completely authentic. We have an ironclad legal conservatorship file." She smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. "You are a corporate accountant, Harper. Your entire career relies on your ethical reputation and your financial competence. If you try to expose us, we will release that massive file to your firm. We will report you to the state licensing board. We will show them the documents proving you have a severe, unmanageable gambling addiction and a history of extreme financial instability. You will be stripped of your CPA license before the end of the month. You will never work in finance again. You will be completely bankrupt, utterly unemployable, and totally alone." The threat was perfectly calculated to hit my deepest vulnerability. They knew exactly how much my career meant to me. They knew I had spent years studying testing and grinding to build my professional reputation. They were holding my entire livelihood hostage to ensure my absolute silence. They had stolen my past, and now they were threatening to completely obliterate my future. "You are monsters," I whispered, pulling my arm out of her grip. "You are absolute monsters. We are your parents," Patricia corrected with a cold, mocking smile. "And you will do exactly what we say." She stepped back and picked up her expensive clutch from the table. William stood up and adjusted his suit jacket. Vanessa finished her wine, stood up, and checked her reflection in the dark glass of the window. They moved with the casual ease of people who had just successfully executed a flawless heist. "Happy birthday, Harper!" Vanessa sneered as she walked past me. "Try not to gamble away your rent money this month." My father did not even look at me as he walked toward the door. He simply opened it and held it for my mother. Patricia paused in the doorway and looked back at me, standing alone in the center of the room. "Oh," she added casually, gesturing toward the table. "We are not paying for this dinner. Since you clearly have no trust fund, I suggest you settle the bill before you leave. We would hate for you to get arrested for theft." They walked out of the restaurant together, a perfect picture of a wealthy, successful family. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind them, leaving me standing completely alone in the silent dining room. I looked down at the table. The leather-bound checkbook rested near the spilled wine. I slowly opened it. The total with gratuity was $840. I stood in the quiet room holding the massive bill. My grandfather was gone. My trust fund was gone. My parents had threatened to destroy my career. I had $42 in my checking account and a severely maxed out credit card. I was supposed to be completely broken. I was supposed to be paralyzed by fear. I was supposed to surrender. But as I stared at the $800 dinner bill they had left me to pay, the overwhelming wave of panic suddenly receded. It was replaced by a cold, calculating, and terrifyingly clear focus. I am an accountant. My parents thought their fake paper trail made them invincible. They thought their shell companies and forged signatures would protect them. But they had made one fatal miscalculation. They had severely underestimated the girl they had abused for 30 years. I knew how to follow the money. I knew how to audit a lie. They wanted to destroy my life, but they had absolutely no idea that I was about to systematically and ruthlessly dismantle theirs. I woke up the next morning on a sagging mattress in an apartment that constantly smelled of damp drywall and cheap bleach. The events of the previous night played on a continuous loop in my mind. My grandfather walking out in disgust. My mother digging her manicured nails into my arm. The $800 dinner bill they left me to pay. I had paid that bill with my only credit card, pushing it perilously close to its absolute limit. I reached for my phone on the nightstand. The screen was severely cracked, a sharp visual contrast to the $10,000 Cartier watch my sister Vanessa had worn to dinner. I opened my mobile banking application to check the exact damage to my primary checking account. I carefully typed in my secure password. A bold red error message instantly flashed across the screen. Access denied. Account frozen. I stared at the harsh red letters as my heart began to pound a frantic and heavy rhythm against my ribs. I closed the application and reopened it. I typed the password again, slower this time. Access denied. Account frozen. I immediately dialed the automated customer service line for my bank. After navigating a maddening maze of robotic prompts, a recorded voice informed me that a joint account holder had placed a hard legal freeze on all linked accounts, pending an internal fraud investigation. A joint account holder. When I was 18 years old, my parents sat me down at our kitchen table and systematically convinced me to add my father William as a joint signer on my newly opened checking account. They told me it was an absolute necessity because of my supposed severe childhood illness. They looked me dead in the eye and claimed that if I ever ended up in the hospital completely incapacitated, they needed emergency legal access to my funds to pay for life-saving medical treatments. I was a naive teenager desperate to please the parents, who constantly reminded me how much of a burden my medical issues had been on the family finances. I signed the banking paperwork without a single question. I had basically handed them the master keys to my entire financial existence. Now, 12 years later, they were using those exact keys to lock me inside a cage. They had maliciously frozen my checking account. They had frozen my modest savings account. They had even frozen the small emergency fund I used to pay for my daily train commute to my accounting firm. I rushed over to my cheap vinyl purse and aggressively dumped the contents onto my scratched linoleum floor. A few crumpled receipts tumbled out along with some loose change and a handful of worn-out bills. I smoothed out the paper money and counted it. $10, $20, $40, $42. I was a 30-year-old corporate accountant working 60 grueling hours a week, and I had exactly $42 to my name. My parents wanted me completely paralyzed. They wanted me starving and terrified and entirely dependent on their mercy. They assumed that freezing my accounts would break my spirit and force me to beg for access to my own money. They knew that if they squeezed me hard enough, I would eventually sign whatever fake legal documents they needed to permanently cover up their massive trust fund theft. The old Harper would have curled up into a tight ball on the floor and sobbed until her eyes burned. The old Harper would have called them begging for forgiveness just to get enough money to buy groceries for the week. But the old Harper died in that private dining room the moment she saw the $4.8 million drained from her name. I did not shed a single tear. I sat on my cheap floor, surrounded by $42, and I went completely cold. I am a corporate accountant. I track missing corporate funds across international borders. I dismantle complex financial fraud for a living. My parents genuinely thought they were criminal masterminds, but they were actually just arrogant thieves who had grown incredibly sloppy over 12 years of unchecked and monumental greed. Digital trails can be wiped or heavily encrypted, but my father was an old-school boomer who fundamentally distrusted cloud storage and digital servers. William was utterly obsessed with physical control. He kept hard copies of every single major financial transaction, every tax return, and every property deed locked inside a massive steel safe in his home office. He arrogantly called it his impenetrable fortress. I called it my primary target. I looked at the digital clock on my cracked phone screen. It was 9 a.m. on a bright Saturday. Every single Saturday for the past decade without fail, William and Patricia attended a lavish brunch service at Vanessa's exclusive country club. They would sit on the sunlit terrace, drinking expensive mimosas and loudly complaining about the working class while rubbing elbows with Chicago's elite. They would not be back home until at least 2 p.m. I had a solid 5-hour window to execute a flawless infiltration. I grabbed my keys and walked out of my miserable apartment. I drove my battered 10-year-old sedan toward their highly upscale neighborhood in the northern suburbs. The drive took exactly 45 minutes. Every single mile that ticked by on the dashboard odometer fueled the burning and violent rage building in my chest. I drove past towering oak trees and manicured green lawns that cost more to maintain than my entire annual salary. I parked my car 2 blocks away from their massive colonial-style estate. I tucked it neatly behind a row of dense privacy hedges so none of their wealthy neighbors would spot my embarrassing vehicle. I walked the rest of the way on foot. The air smelled intensely of fresh mulch and expensive fertilizer. I walked up the long, sweeping driveway and approached the heavy mahogany front door. I reached deep into my jacket pocket and pulled out a tarnished brass key. It was my old childhood house key. My parents had never bothered to change the locks when they practically forced me out of their lives. They never viewed me as a legitimate threat. They viewed me as a pathetic and obedient dog who would never dare to bite the hand that occasionally tossed her scraps. I slid the key into the lock and turned it. The deadbolt clicked open with a satisfyingly heavy thud. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The house was dead silent. The central air conditioning was humming softly. The scent of my mother's signature expensive vanilla candles hung thick and heavy in the air. I walked past the sprawling living room adorned with custom Italian leather furniture and original oil paintings. I walked past the grand sweeping staircase, where a massive framed portrait of Vanessa in her custom wedding dress hung in the place of absolute honor. There were absolutely no pictures of me anywhere in the house. It was like I had never even existed in their world. I did not let the emotional sting slow me down for a single second. I moved silently down the pristine hardwood hallway and approached the solid oak doors of my father's home office. The door was securely locked, but William was deeply and tragically predictable. He always kept a spare key hidden inside the hollowed-out base of a fake decorative plant sitting on the hall console table. I tipped the heavy plant over, retrieved the small silver key, and smoothly unlocked the office door. The office was impeccably clean and smelled of rich leather. Floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves lined the walls. A massive executive desk dominated the center of the room. Tucked away in the far corner, bolted directly to the floor, and the wall studs was the steel safe. It was a heavy-duty commercial-grade vault with a glowing digital keypad. I knelt down on the plush carpet and stared at the bright green numbers. 3 incorrect attempts and the safe would initiate a permanent lockdown protocol that would automatically send a security alert directly to my father's phone. I had to get this exactly right on the first try. I closed my eyes and put myself inside my father's deeply narcissistic mind. He was not a creative man. He was a man driven entirely by his obsessions and his blatant favoritism. His password would not be a random sequence of secure numbers. It would be something he worshipped above all else. I thought about the massive portrait hanging in the hallway. I thought about the $4.8 million funneled out of my trust fund to support a singular priority in his life. I reached out and typed a 6-digit sequence. 082494. August 24th, 1994. Vanessa's birth date. I pressed the enter key. The keypad beeped once. A green light flashed brightly, and the heavy steel locking mechanisms retracted with a loud and echoing mechanical clank. The heavy safe door swung open. My stomach dropped completely out of my body. The vault was packed to the brim with neatly labeled manila folders, thick legal binders, and stack after stack of banking documents. They had kept absolutely everything. Every single fraudulent transaction, every forged document, and every stolen dollar was meticulously chronicled in my father's own obsessive filing system. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, opened the camera application, and went to work. I moved like a programmed machine. I pulled out the first thick binder labeled Estate Assets. I opened it and immediately found the foundational documents of a corporate entity named Vanny Corp. LLC. It was a shell company registered in the state of Delaware to obscure its true ownership and shield it from standard audits. But my father had kept the original operating agreements right here in his safe. The sole managing members of Vanny Corp. Were William Evans, Patricia Evans, and Vanessa Evans. I flipped the page and found the primary funding source documents. The initial capital injection used to legally establish the LLC was a wire transfer of exactly $400,000. The source account listed on the bank receipt perfectly matched the routing number of my stolen trust fund. They had taken my grandfather's money and used it to instantly capitalize a secret family corporation that I was entirely excluded from. I took clear and high-resolution photos of every single page. I pulled out another folder labeled Real Estate Holdings. Inside was the original property deed and the executed purchase agreement for Vanessa's massive luxury mansion. My sister always claimed that she and her husband had worked tirelessly to afford that spectacular home, but the closing documents completely destroyed that fake narrative. The house was purchased entirely in cash. The funds were wired directly from the Vanny Corp. Offshore accounts. They used my stolen money to buy my sister a sprawling estate while I struggled to pay for basic electricity. I kept digging deeper into the vault. I found the official payoff letters for my parents' own residential mortgages. Both of their luxury properties were completely paid off free and clear. The funding source for the massive payoffs was listed as a series of direct wire transfers from my trust fund. But the most sickening discovery, the one that truly made me want to vomit right there on the plush office carpet, was tucked inside a thin blue folder labeled Recurring Medical Expenses. For my entire adult life, my parents had guilted me into sending them $2,000 every single month. They claimed this money was desperately needed to pay off the crushing medical debt from a childhood illness they swore I had. They told me the debt was drowning them. They told me I owed them my life. I opened the blue folder. Inside was a massive stack of monthly invoices from a premier luxury marina located on Lake Michigan. The invoices were for the monthly docking fees, the luxury interior detailing, and the premium winter storage of a massive 50-foot yacht, registered entirely under Vanny Corp. The total monthly maintenance fee for the yacht was exactly $2,000, The crushing medical debt was completely fabricated. The childhood illness was a disgusting lie. Every time I skipped a meal, every time I worked a grueling weekend shift, every time I denied myself basic human comforts to send them that money, I was literally paying the docking fees for my sister's luxury yacht. My own parents had financially bled me dry to subsidize a boat. I photographed the marina invoices. My hands were perfectly steady now. The profound and shattering betrayal had burned away any lingering traces of fear or hesitation. I was capturing the exact ammunition I needed to completely destroy their lives. As I reached for the final stack of documents at the very bottom of the safe, a separate heavily sealed envelope caught my eye. It was labeled Marcus Legal. Marcus was Vanessa's husband. He was a brilliant and intensely hardworking African-American architect who ran a highly successful design firm in the city. I had only met Marcus a handful of times at highly supervised family functions, but he always struck me as a genuinely decent man who simply worked too much to notice the toxic dynamics of the Evans family. Vanessa constantly bragged about how Marcus was paying all their massive property taxes and funding their lavish lifestyle because her own consulting business was temporarily struggling. I ripped open the sealed envelope. Inside was a secondary property deed and a stack of heavily redacted loan documents. I quickly scanned the dense financial jargon. Vanessa had not just stolen from me. She was actively bleeding her own husband dry. The documents revealed that Vanessa had secretly taken out a massive and highly predatory second mortgage on the mansion using Marcus's pristine credit score. She had blatantly forged his signature on the loan applications. The massive loan proceeds were immediately transferred into a hidden offshore account solely controlled by Vanny Corp. Marcus was working 70 hours a week to pay off a fraudulent debt he had absolutely no idea existed. His entire marriage was built on a foundation of staggering financial abuse. My parents and my sister were systematically bankrupting an innocent man in the dark. I photographed the forged loan documents and carefully placed everything back exactly where I found it. I closed the heavy steel door of the vault, typed the birth date to lock it securely, and wiped the keypad clean with my sleeve. I had walked into this house with exactly $42 in frozen bank accounts. I was walking out with the keys to their absolute destruction. I slipped out the front door and walked briskly back to my battered car. My parents wanted a war over money. They had absolutely no idea they had just handed a corporate financial auditor the exact blueprint to their own execution. I woke up the next morning on a sagging mattress in an apartment that constantly smelled of damp drywall and cheap bleach. The events of the previous night played on a continuous loop in my mind. My grandfather walking out in disgust. My mother digging her manicured nails into my arm. The $800 dinner bill they left me to pay. I had paid that bill with my only credit card, pushing it perilously close to its absolute limit. I reached for my phone on the nightstand. The screen was severely cracked, a sharp visual contrast to the $10,000 Cartier watch my sister Vanessa had worn to dinner. I opened my mobile banking application to check the exact damage to my primary checking account. I carefully typed in my secure password. A bold red error message instantly flashed across the screen. Access denied. Account frozen. I stared at the harsh red letters as my heart began to pound, a frantic and heavy rhythm against my ribs. I closed the application and reopened it. I typed the password again, slower this time. Access denied. Account frozen. I immediately dialed the automated customer service line for my bank. After navigating a maddening maze of robotic prompts, a recorded voice informed me that a joint account holder had placed a hard legal freeze on all linked accounts pending an internal fraud investigation. A joint account holder. When I was 18 years old, my parents sat me down at our kitchen table and systematically convinced me to add my father William as a joint signer on my newly opened checking account. They told me it was an absolute necessity because of my supposed severe childhood illness. They looked me dead in the eye and claimed that if I ever ended up in the hospital completely incapacitated, they needed emergency legal access to my funds to pay for life-saving medical treatments. I was a naive teenager desperate to please the parents, who constantly reminded me how much of a burden my medical issues had been on the family finances. I signed the banking paperwork without a single question. I had basically handed them the master keys to my entire financial existence. Now, 12 years later, they were using those exact keys to lock me inside a cage. They had maliciously frozen my checking account. They had frozen my modest savings account. They had even frozen the small emergency fund I used to pay for my daily train commute to my accounting firm. I dumped my cheap purse onto the scratched linoleum floor. A few crumpled receipts tumbled out along with some loose change and a handful of worn-out bills. I smoothed out the paper money and counted it. $42. I was a 30-year-old corporate accountant working 60 grueling hours a week, and I had exactly $42 to my name. My parents wanted me completely paralyzed. They wanted me starving and terrified and entirely dependent on their mercy. They assumed that freezing my accounts would break my spirit and force me to beg for access to my own money. They knew that if they squeezed me hard enough, I would eventually sign whatever fake legal documents they needed to permanently cover up their massive trust fund theft. The old Harper would have curled up into a tight ball on the floor and sobbed until her eyes burned. The old Harper would have called them begging for forgiveness just to get enough money to buy groceries for the week. But the old Harper died in that private dining room the moment she saw the $4.8 million drained from her name. I did not shed a single tear. I sat on my cheap floor surrounded by $42, and I went completely cold. I am a corporate accountant. I track missing corporate funds across international borders. I dismantle complex financial fraud for a living. My parents genuinely thought they were criminal masterminds, but they were actually just arrogant thieves who had grown incredibly sloppy over 12 years of unchecked and monumental greed. Digital trails can be wiped or heavily encrypted, but my father was an old-school boomer who fundamentally distrusted cloud storage and digital servers. William was utterly obsessed with physical control. He kept hard copies of every single major financial transaction, every tax return, and every property deed locked inside a massive steel safe in his home office. He arrogantly called it his impenetrable fortress. I called it my primary target. I looked at the digital clock on my cracked phone screen. It was 9 in the morning on a bright Saturday. Every single Saturday for the past decade without fail, William and Patricia attended a lavish brunch service at Vanessa's exclusive country club. They would sit on the sunlit terrace drinking expensive mimosas and loudly complaining about the working class while rubbing elbows with Chicago's elite. They would not be back home until at least 2 in the afternoon. I had a solid 5-hour window to execute a flawless infiltration. I grabbed my keys and walked out of my miserable apartment. I drove my battered 10-year-old sedan toward their highly upscale neighborhood in the northern suburbs. The drive took exactly 45 minutes. Every single mile that ticked by on the dashboard odometer fueled the burning and violent rage building in my chest. I drove past towering oak trees and manicured green lawns that cost more to maintain than my entire annual salary. I parked my car 2 blocks away from their massive colonial-style estate. I tucked it neatly behind a row of dense privacy hedges, so none of their wealthy neighbors would spot my embarrassing vehicle. I walked the rest of the way on foot. The air smelled intensely of fresh mulch and expensive fertilizer. I walked up the long, sweeping driveway and approached the heavy mahogany front door. I reached deep into my jacket pocket and pulled out a tarnished brass key. It was my old childhood house key. My parents had never bothered to change the locks when they practically forced me out of their lives. They never viewed me as a legitimate threat. They viewed me as a pathetic and obedient dog who would never dare to bite the hand that occasionally tossed her scraps. I slid the key into the lock and turned it. The deadbolt clicked open with a satisfyingly heavy thud. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The house was dead silent. The central air conditioning was humming softly. The scent of my mother's signature expensive vanilla candles hung thick and heavy in the air. I walked past the sprawling living room adorned with custom Italian leather furniture and original oil paintings. I walked past the grand sweeping staircase, where a massive framed portrait of Vanessa in her custom wedding dress hung in the place of absolute honor. There were absolutely no pictures of me anywhere in the house. It was like I had never even existed in their world. I did not let the emotional sting slow me down for a single second. I moved silently down the pristine hardwood hallway and approached the solid oak doors of my father's home office. The door was securely locked, But William was deeply and tragically predictable. He always kept a spare key hidden inside the hollowed-out base of a fake decorative plant, sitting on the hall console table. I tipped the heavy plant over, retrieved the small silver key, and smoothly unlocked the office door. The office was impeccably clean and smelled of rich leather. Floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves lined the walls. A massive executive desk dominated the center of the room. Tucked away in the far corner, bolted directly to the floor, and the wall studs was the steel safe. It was a heavy-duty commercial-grade vault with a glowing digital keypad. I knelt down on the plush carpet and stared at the bright green numbers. 3 incorrect attempts and the safe would initiate a permanent lockdown protocol that would automatically send a security alert directly to my father's phone. I had to get this exactly right on the first try. I closed my eyes and put myself inside my father's deeply narcissistic mind. He was not a creative man. He was a man driven entirely by his obsessions and his blatant favoritism. His password would not be a random sequence of secure numbers. It would be something he worshipped above all else. I thought about the massive portrait hanging in the hallway. I thought about the $4.8 million funneled out of my trust fund to support a singular priority in his life. I reached out and typed a 6-digit sequence. 082494, August 24th, 1994, Vanessa's birth date. I pressed the enter key. The keypad beeped once. A green light flashed brightly, and the heavy steel locking mechanisms retracted with a loud and echoing mechanical clank. The heavy safe door swung open. My stomach dropped completely out of my body. The vault was packed to the brim with neatly labeled manila folders, thick legal binders, and stack after stack of banking documents. They had kept absolutely everything. Every single fraudulent transaction, every forged document, and every stolen dollar was meticulously chronicled in my father's own obsessive filing system. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, opened the camera application, and went to work. I moved like a programmed machine. I pulled out the first thick binder labeled Estate Assets. I opened it and immediately found the foundational documents of a corporate entity named Vanny Corp LLC. It was a shell company registered in the state of Delaware to obscure its true ownership and shield it from standard audits. But my father had kept the original operating agreements right here in his safe. The sole managing members of Vanny Corp were William Evans, Patricia Evans, and Vanessa Evans. I flipped the page and found the primary funding source documents. The initial capital injection used to legally establish the LLC was a wire transfer of exactly $400,000. The source account listed on the bank receipt perfectly matched the routing number of my stolen trust fund. They had taken my grandfather's money and used it to instantly capitalize a secret family corporation that I was entirely excluded from. I took clear and high-resolution photos of every single page. I pulled out another folder labeled Real Estate Holdings. Inside was the original property deed and the executed purchase agreement for Vanessa's massive luxury mansion. My sister always claimed that she and her husband had worked tirelessly to afford that spectacular home. But the closing documents completely destroyed that fake narrative. The house was purchased entirely in cash. The funds were wired directly from the Vanny Corp offshore accounts. They used my stolen money to buy my sister a sprawling estate, while I struggled to pay for basic electricity. I kept digging deeper into the vault. I found the official payoff letters for my parents' own residential mortgages. Both of their luxury properties were completely paid off free and clear. The funding source for the massive payoffs was listed as a series of direct wire transfers from my trust fund. But the most sickening discovery, the one that truly made me want to vomit right there on the plush office carpet, was tucked inside a thin blue folder labeled Recurring Medical Expenses. For my entire adult life, my parents had guilted me into sending them $2,000 every single month. They claimed this money was desperately needed to pay off the crushing medical debt from a childhood illness they swore I had. They told me the debt was drowning them. They told me I owed them my life. I opened the blue folder. Inside was a massive stack of monthly invoices from a premier luxury marina located on Lake Michigan. The invoices were for the monthly docking fees, the luxury interior detailing, and the premium winter storage of a massive 50-foot yacht registered entirely under Vanny Corp. The total monthly maintenance fee for the yacht was exactly $2,000. The crushing medical debt was completely fabricated. The childhood illness was a disgusting lie. Every time I skipped a meal, every time I worked a grueling weekend shift, every time I denied myself basic human comforts to send them that money, I was literally paying the docking fees for my sister's luxury yacht. My own parents had financially bled me dry to subsidize a boat. I photographed the marina invoices. My hands were perfectly steady now. The profound and shattering betrayal had burned away any lingering traces of fear or hesitation. I was capturing the exact ammunition I needed to completely destroy their lives. As I reached for the final stack of documents at the very bottom of the safe, a separate heavily sealed envelope caught my eye. It was labeled Marcus Legal. Marcus was Vanessa's husband. He was a brilliant and intensely hardworking African-American architect who ran a highly successful design firm in the city. I had only met Marcus a handful of times at highly supervised family functions, but he always struck me as a genuinely decent man who simply worked too much to notice the toxic dynamics of the Evans family. Vanessa constantly bragged about how Marcus was paying all their massive property taxes and funding their lavish lifestyle because her own consulting business was temporarily struggling. I ripped open the sealed envelope. Inside was a secondary property deed and a stack of heavily redacted loan documents. I quickly scanned the dense financial jargon. Vanessa had not just stolen from me. She was actively bleeding her own husband dry. The documents revealed that Vanessa had secretly taken out a massive and highly predatory second mortgage on the mansion using Marcus's pristine credit score. She had blatantly forged his signature on the loan applications. The massive loan proceeds were immediately transferred into a hidden offshore account solely controlled by Vanny Corp. Marcus was working 70 hours a week to pay off a fraudulent debt he had absolutely no idea existed. His entire marriage was built on a foundation of staggering financial abuse. My parents and my sister were systematically bankrupting an innocent man in the dark. I photographed the forged loan documents and carefully placed everything back exactly where I found it. I closed the heavy steel door of the vault, typed the birth date to lock it securely, and wiped the keypad clean with my sleeve. I had walked into this house with exactly $42 and frozen bank accounts. I was walking out with the keys to their absolute destruction. I slipped out the front door and walked briskly back to my battered car. My parents wanted a war over money. They had absolutely no idea they had just handed a corporate financial auditor the exact blueprint to their own execution. It was mid-afternoon on a Saturday, but I knew exactly where Marcus would be. He was always working. I drove straight from the wealthy northern suburbs down into the heart of the city. I parked my car in a cheap public lot and walked 3 blocks to the sleek glass building that housed his architectural firm. The weekend security desk was empty, so I slipped into the elevator behind a delivery courier. I pressed the button for the 14th floor. My hands were sweating, but I wiped them forcefully on my trousers. I had to be flawless. I had to present this evidence not as an angry sister, but as a forensic accountant presenting a fatal audit. The elevator doors slid open to a stunning reception area with exposed brick walls and massive drafting tables visible through floor-to-ceiling glass partitions. The office was mostly empty for the weekend, but a single light was glowing warmly from the corner executive suite. I walked down the quiet corridor. The silence was broken only by the sharp click of my cheap shoes against the polished concrete floor. I reached the open doorway of his office. Marcus was standing over a massive angled drafting table. He was wearing a simple gray t-shirt and dark jeans. He looked profoundly exhausted. Deep dark circles shadowed his eyes, and he was rubbing his temples while staring at a complex set of blueprints. He was spending his weekend desperately trying to keep his family afloat, while his wife was likely sipping expensive champagne at her country club using my stolen money. I stepped into the doorway and cleared my throat. Marcus jumped slightly and spun around. When he saw it was me, his face instantly hardened. The welcoming smile he usually reserved for clients was completely absent. The muscles in his jaw tightened, and he crossed his arms defensively over his chest. "Harper," he said. His voice was clipped and deliberately cold. "What are you doing here? The building is secure on weekends." I stepped fully into the office and let the heavy glass door slide shut behind me. "I need to talk to you, Marcus," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "It is about Vanessa, and it is about your finances." Marcus immediately shook his head and took a step back. His posture became incredibly rigid. "No," he said firmly. "I am not doing this, Harper. Vanessa warned me you might try something like this. She told me about your relapse. She told me about the dinner last night and how you completely lost your mind when your parents refused to bail you out again. The lie was so deeply entrenched that it actually made me physically nauseous. Vanessa had perfectly primed him. She had painted me as an unstable and dangerous addict to ensure that if I ever tried to expose her, Marcus would completely dismiss me as a desperate liar looking for cash. I do not gamble, Marcus," I said, keeping my eyes locked directly on his. "I have never gambled a day in my life. I am a corporate accountant. I work 60 hours a week auditing financial statements. Do I look like someone who drops $50,000 on offshore betting sites?" Marcus scoffed and shook his head again. "High-functioning addicts are the best liars, Harper. Vanessa told me everything. She told me how much your parents sacrificed to send you to private rehab facilities. She told me how you forged documents to steal from them. I am not giving you any money. I am going to ask you to leave my office right now before I call building security." The profound irony of his words almost made me laugh. Vanessa had masterfully projected all of her own horrific crimes directly onto me. She accused me of the exact financial frauds she was currently committing against him. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I simply walked directly up to his drafting table. I pulled my cracked phone from my pocket and opened the hidden photo album I had created just an hour ago in my father's office. "I'm not here to ask you for money, Marcus," I said. "I am here to show you where your money is actually going." I placed my phone directly on top of his intricate blueprints. The first image glowing on the cracked screen was the original operating agreement for the shell company named Vanny Corp LLC. "Look at the managing members, Marcus," I demanded. "Look at the funding source." Marcus did not want to look. He tried to turn his head away, but his natural analytical instincts betrayed him. His eyes snagged on the glowing screen. As an architect, he dealt with property developers and corporate holding companies every single day. He intimately understood how limited liability companies were structured. He leaned in closer. He saw his wife's name listed alongside my parents as the sole managing members of the hidden corporation. He saw the initial capitalization wire transfer of $400,000, matching the exact routing number of my stolen trust fund. "What is this?" he whispered. His voice lost its defensive edge and became incredibly hollow. I swiped to the next photograph. "This is the deed to your luxury mansion," I said, pointing to the screen. "You thought you bought that house with a traditional mortgage. You thought your wife contributed her savings to the down payment. But look at the purchasing entity. The house was purchased completely in cash by Vanny Corp. They used my stolen trust fund to buy your house free and clear. You do not own your home, Marcus. Your wife and her parents own it through a shell company." Marcus grabbed my phone with trembling hands. He swiped to the next photo himself. It was the heavily redacted loan document I had found in the separate envelope. I watched the exact moment his entire reality shattered into pieces. As a man who handled multi-million-dollar commercial construction loans, he instantly recognized the aggressive and predatory terms of the secondary mortgage document glowing on the screen. He saw the property address. He saw the astronomical loan amount. And then he saw the signature line. His own signature was scrawled perfectly across the bottom of the page. "That is not my signature," he gasped. The air seemed to completely leave his lungs. He stumbled backward and heavily hit the edge of his mahogany desk. "That is my name, but I never signed this document. I have never seen this paper in my entire life." I took a step toward him. "Vanessa forged your signature, Marcus," I said softly but firmly. "She took out a massive secondary mortgage on the property you think you own. She leveraged your pristine credit score to secure a massive cash loan. And look at the disbursement instructions at the bottom of the page." Marcus forced himself to look at the screen again. The loan proceeds were not deposited into their joint marital checking account. The massive lump sum was wired directly into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, controlled exclusively by Vanny Corp. "Your wife is not struggling with her consulting business," I explained. "She is systematically liquidating your shared assets and hoarding the cash in an offshore account you cannot legally access. You have been working 70-hour weeks to pay the property taxes and the lifestyle expenses, while she is actively bleeding your net worth dry to fund a secret life. Marcus collapsed heavily into his leather desk chair. He dropped his face into his hands. His broad shoulders began to shake violently. The powerful and successful architect was completely broken. He had sacrificed his time, his energy, and his peace of mind to build a beautiful life for a woman who viewed him as nothing more than a convenient financial host. I knew exactly how he felt. I knew the suffocating agony of realizing that the people you loved unconditionally were actually calculated predators draining your lifeblood in the dark. I did not offer him empty comfort. I did not tell him everything would be all right. I pulled up the final photograph on my phone. It was the stack of monthly invoices from the luxury marina for the massive 50-foot yacht registered to Vanny Corp. I placed the phone gently on his desk right in front of him. "They stole $4.8 million from my trust fund over 12 years, I said quietly. They told my grandfather I was a gambling addict to cover their tracks. They left me with $42 in my bank account and threatened to destroy my accounting career if I ever spoke up. They think we are stupid, Marcus. They think we are just blind, obedient workers who will quietly fund their luxury yachts and their offshore accounts until we completely collapse from exhaustion." Marcus slowly lowered his hands. His dark eyes were completely red and rimmed with unshed tears, but the despair in his expression was rapidly transforming into something else. It was transforming into the exact same cold and calculating rage that was currently burning in my own chest. He picked up my cracked phone and stared at the marina invoices for a long time. Then he looked up at me. His jaw was locked tight. "What do we do now, Harper?" he asked. His voice was no longer broken. It was dangerously calm and absolutely resolute. I sat down in the leather chair across from him and folded my hands in my lap. "We form an alliance," I replied. "I know how to track every single stolen dollar across international borders. You know how to force a rapid liquidation of physical real estate assets. We are not just going to divorce them and walk away. We are going to orchestrate a flawless financial execution. We are going to take back every single thing they stole, and we are going to leave them with absolutely nothing." Marcus nodded once. The partnership was instantly sealed. Two completely innocent people who had been violently exploited by the Evans family were now joining forces to burn their fraudulent empire completely to the ground. The ambush at his architectural firm had worked perfectly. We had the evidence. We had the motive. And now we were going to prepare the ultimate trap. Marcus did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. He pulled out his sleek black credit card and pushed it across the drafting table toward me. He told me to use whatever I needed to secure a room at the luxury hotel, where my grandfather and his attorney were staying before their flight back to Europe. We were no longer just two victims commiserating over our shared trauma. We were a highly organized coalition preparing to execute a financial war. I took the card with a firm nod and left his architectural firm with a renewed sense of absolute purpose. I drove back to my moldy, cramped apartment one last time. I did not pack clothes. I packed my heavy-duty laptop, my portable scanner, and every single physical receipt I had hoarded over the last decade. I spent the entire night awake at my tiny kitchen table drinking bitter instant coffee and compiling the most devastating financial portfolio of my entire career. I am a corporate accountant who tracks multi-million-dollar discrepancies for massive conglomerates. Building a forensic audit of my own parents' pathetic shell companies was like solving a child's puzzle. I created a flawless, color-coded spreadsheet that tracked every single fraudulent withdrawal, from my trust fund directly to the corresponding luxury purchases made by William, Patricia, and Vanessa. I highlighted the yacht maintenance fees in bright red. I marked the offshore transfers in deep blue. I cross-referenced the forged secondary mortgage on Marcus House with the capitalization documents for Vanny Corp. By the time the sun began to rise over the Chicago skyline, I had built a completely bulletproof legal weapon. I arrived at the grand entrance of the five-star hotel just before 9 in the morning. The lobby was a vast expanse of polished marble and sparkling crystal chandeliers. It was the kind of place my parents pretended they belonged, but could only afford by actively stealing my future. I bypassed the main reception desk and walked purposefully toward the executive business center. I knew that a ruthless and meticulous estate attorney like Mr. Sterling would not be wasting his morning sipping tea in a suite. He would be working. My instincts were absolutely correct. I found him sitting alone in a glass-walled conference room, reviewing a thick stack of legal briefs. He was wearing the same sharp gray suit from the night before, looking completely detached and professional. I pushed open the heavy glass door without knocking. He looked up with a sharp flash of annoyance that quickly morphed into cold recognition. He opened his mouth to speak, but I cut him off before he could utter a single syllable of dismissal. "I am not here to speak to my grandfather," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotional desperation. "I am here to speak to you, attorney to accountant. I know my parents handed you a fabricated file last night, claiming I am a severely mentally ill gambling addict. I know they showed you forged medical records and power of attorney documents. I also know that you are a highly intelligent man who relies on empirical data. I am asking you for exactly 10 minutes of your time to review actual certified financial data. If you look at my audit and still believe their pathetic lies, I will walk out of this hotel and you will never see me again." Mr. Sterling stared at me with his piercing analytical eyes. He did not see a hysterical addict. He saw a 30-year-old woman radiating absolute and terrifying calm. He slowly closed his legal brief and gestured toward the empty leather chair directly across from him. "You have exactly 10 minutes, Miss Evans," he said, his tone entirely neutral. I sat down and immediately opened my laptop. I did not waste time with tears or emotional pleas. I spoke in the precise clinical language of financial auditing. I turned the screen toward him and walked him through the master spreadsheet. I started with the initial $5 million deposit. I showed him the forged authorization signatures my parents had used to initiate the first wave of wire transfers. I placed my own certified signature next to the documents they had provided him to demonstrate the blatant and sloppy discrepancies in the penmanship. Then I brought up the corporate registration documents for Vanny Corp. I watched Mr. Sterling lean forward slightly as I revealed that the managing members of this hidden entity were William, Patricia, and Vanessa. I clicked to the next tab. I showed him the exact timestamps of the massive trust fund withdrawals and perfectly aligned them with the cash purchase of Vanessa's luxury mansion and the complete payoff of my parents' residential mortgages. I did not stop there. I pulled up the invoices for the 50-foot yacht. I explained how my parents had systematically extorted $2,000 from my personal salary every single month by claiming they were drowning in medical debt from a fake childhood illness. I showed him how that exact amount was automatically routed to a luxury marina on Lake Michigan to pay the docking fees for a boat they bought with his client's money. Finally, I presented the absolute kill shot. I showed him the forged secondary mortgage documents that Vanessa had secretly taken out against her innocent husband's property. Mr. Sterling stopped breathing for a few seconds. The cold indifference completely vanished from his face. He leaned so close to the screen that his nose almost touched the glass. His eyes rapidly darted back and forth across the color-coded columns, verifying the dates and the routing numbers, and the undeniable flow of stolen capital. He was a legal shark who had built his career on protecting massive estates. He realized in real time that he had been brazenly lied to by a pair of amateur suburban thieves. He realized that the grand narrative of the tragic addicted daughter was a meticulously crafted smokescreen designed to hide one of the most disgusting breaches of fiduciary duty he had ever witnessed. "You compiled this entire forensic audit overnight," he asked, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I am a senior corporate accountant," I replied smoothly. "I audit complex international supply chains for a living. Tracking a few $1 million through a poorly constructed domestic shell company was incredibly simple once I cracked my father's physical safe this morning. I have $42 in my checking account right now, Mr. Sterling. My parents froze my assets yesterday to ensure I could not afford legal counsel. They thought they completely paralyzed me. They were wrong." Mr. Sterling did not say another word. He stood up from his chair, pulled his mobile phone from his pocket, and dialed a room number. He waited 2 seconds before speaking. "Sir, please come down to the business center immediately. We have a severe situation that requires your absolute attention." He hung up the phone and looked down at me. The shark was officially circling the water. "You are an incredibly dangerous woman, Miss Evans," he murmured with a faint trace of genuine professional respect. I simply smiled and closed my laptop screen halfway. Less than 5 minutes later, the heavy glass door of the conference room swung open again. Grandpa Harrison walked in leaning heavily on his wooden cane. He looked exhausted and deeply aggravated by the sudden summons. When he saw me sitting at the conference table, his expression instantly darkened into the same look of profound disgust he had worn the night before. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, looking sharply at his attorney. "I told you I never wanted to see this disgraceful girl again. Get her out of this hotel before I call security." Mr. Sterling did not flinch. He did not apologize for bringing me into the room. He stepped forward and placed his hand gently but firmly on the back of the leather chair next to him. "Please sit down, sir," he said, his tone carrying an absolute authority that brooked no argument. "You need to look at what your granddaughter has brought us. The file your son gave us last night is a complete and total fabrication. You have been lied to in the most grotesque manner imaginable." My grandfather froze. He looked at Mr. Sterling and then slowly shifted his gaze to me. He cautiously lowered himself into the chair. I opened my laptop screen fully and began the presentation from the very beginning. I did not soften the blow. I did not try to spare his feelings. I dragged him through every single agonizing layer of the betrayal. I showed him the fake medical debt. I showed him the yacht. I showed him the mansion. I showed him the shell company. I laid bare the absolute reality that his own son had spent 12 years treating my life like a disposable financial resource to fund a fantasy world of unearned luxury. I pulled up a photograph of my moldy, cramped studio apartment. I placed it right next to a photograph of Vanessa's sprawling estate. "This is where I live," I said, my voice completely steady but laced with a cold, heavy truth. "I live in a place where the ceiling leaks when it rains and the heating barely works in the winter. I ate cheap noodles and skipped meals so I could send your son $2,000 a month because he looked me in the eye and told me I owed him for keeping me alive when I was sick as a child. I was never sick. I was never a gambling addict. I was just the convenient scapegoat they used to drain your money while looking like tragic heroes." I watched my grandfather's entire worldview completely shatter. The rigid posture he had maintained for decades violently crumbled. His shoulders sagged. His hands began to shake uncontrollably. He stared at the photograph of my miserable apartment and then at the pristine ledgers proving the theft. The horrific realization of what he had done the night before, of how he had looked at me with disgust and abandoned me to the monsters who were bleeding me dry, crashed over him like a physical wave. He covered his face with his weathered hands. A raw, agonizing sob tore from his throat. It was the sound of a proud, powerful man realizing he had been played for an absolute fool by his own flesh and blood. "Harper," he wept, his voice cracking and breaking with profound sorrow. "My God, Harper, what have I done? I am so sorry. I am so incredibly sorry. I abandoned you. I left you with them. Please forgive me." He reached across the table trying to grasp my hand. I smoothly pulled my hand back and folded it securely in my lap. I sat perfectly upright and stared at him with eyes that felt like dark, heavy stones. "I do not want your tears, Grandpa," I said, cutting through his apologies with a voice of pure ice. "Tears do not change the past. Apologies do not rebuild the decade I lost living in a state of constant survival while they paraded around in designer clothes. I am not here to seek comfort, and I am not here to just get my stolen money back." My grandfather slowly lowered his hands. He looked at me through his tears, deeply shocked by the absolute lack of warmth in my voice. Mr. Sterling stood perfectly still, watching the exchange with intense fascination. "Then what do you want?" My grandfather asked, his voice barely a whisper. I leaned forward and placed my hands flat on the polished table. "I want them to feel exactly what it is like to lose absolutely everything," I stated clearly, deliberately, letting every single word land with maximum impact. "I want them to wake up and realize their bank accounts are completely frozen. I want them to watch their luxury cars get towed away in the middle of the night. I want them to be publicly stripped of their fake wealth and their fake status in front of every single person they have ever tried to impress. I want them to be indicted. I want them terrified. I want to utterly destroy them." The silence in the glass conference room was so profound it felt like a vacuum. My grandfather stared at me, seeing for the first time the hardened, ruthless woman his son had inadvertently created. He did not argue. He did not suggest grace or family forgiveness. He slowly wiped the tears from his weathered face and gave a single sharp nod of absolute agreement. I turned my gaze to the attorney. Mr. Sterling was looking down at my color-coded spreadsheets. Slowly, the corner of his mouth twitched upward. It grew into a chilling, predatory smile. He closed his legal brief and leaned against the table. "Well then, Miss Evans," the lawyer said, his voice dropping to a smooth, dangerous purr. "If absolute destruction is what you require, I suggest we immediately begin drafting the proper federal notifications. The counterattack begins right now." I smiled back. The trap was finally set. 3 days after the disastrous birthday dinner, my cracked phone vibrated on the cheap laminate counter of my apartment. The caller ID displayed my mother's name. I let it ring 4 times before I finally picked it up, ensuring I sounded appropriately exhausted and defeated. Patricia did not offer a greeting. She simply issued a command. She told me to come to the family house immediately for an intervention. She used that exact word, intervention. She said my father and Vanessa were waiting, and that they had a solution to my so-called crisis, but only if I was ready to finally cooperate. I hung up the phone and stared at the blank screen for a long moment. My pulse was steady. My mind was perfectly clear. I had spent my entire life cowering from my mother's demands, but today I was stepping into the war zone completely armed. I changed into a faded oversized sweater and completely avoided wearing any makeup. I needed to look like the absolute wreck they expected me to be. I needed to look like a desperate woman who had spent the last 72 hours starving and panicking over her frozen bank accounts. I drove my battered sedan back to the wealthy northern suburbs, playing the role of the broken daughter the entire way. When I walked through the heavy mahogany front doors of their estate, the atmosphere was thick with suffocating arrogance. They had arranged the living room to maximize their psychological advantage. My father William sat in his oversized leather armchair, looking like a disappointed judge. Patricia stood by the massive stone fireplace with her arms tightly crossed over her cashmere cardigan. Vanessa sat on the pristine white sofa, examining her perfectly manicured nails, while wearing another designer outfit paid for with my stolen trust fund. They had formed a unified tribunal designed to crush whatever fight I had left in me. I stood in the center of the room, keeping my shoulders slumped and my eyes fixed firmly on the expensive Persian rug. "Have a seat," Harper, my father ordered, gesturing to a small, rigid chair positioned directly in front of them. I sat down and wrapped my arms around myself, allowing my hands to visibly tremble. My parents exchanged a swift, highly satisfied glance. They completely bought the performance. They saw a woman broken by poverty and fear, entirely unaware that they were looking at a forensic accountant actively auditing their every move. "We are not going to drag this out," Patricia began, her voice dripping with artificial maternal concern. "Your stunt at the restaurant with your grandfather was a complete disaster. You humiliated this family. You tried to shift the blame for your own severe addictions onto us. But we are your parents, Harper. Despite everything you have done to destroy us, we still want to save you from yourself." I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from screaming. The audacity of her gaslighting was almost breathtaking. I kept my eyes lowered and forced a small, pathetic sniffle. "Your mother and I have spoken with our legal counsel," William continued, leaning forward and adopting a tone of stern benevolence. "We understand that your accounts being frozen has caused you some immediate distress. We also understand that your gambling debts have likely put you in a very dangerous position. We are willing to offer you a permanent lifeline, but it comes with absolute and non-negotiable conditions." William reached onto the glass coffee table and picked up a thick legal document. He held it out toward me. I reached out with a shaking hand and took the packet. The header of the document was dense with legal jargon, but my trained eyes instantly decoded the underlying mechanics. It was a comprehensive fiduciary waiver and a total release of liability. By signing this document, I would legally swear that William and Patricia Evans had acted as my lawful conservators. I would legally swear that every single withdrawal from my $5 million trust fund was authorized, legitimate, and utilized entirely for my own medical and rehabilitation benefit. It was an ironclad non-disclosure agreement, combined with a retroactive authorization of their massive theft. If I signed this paper, they would be completely immunized against any future civil or criminal prosecution. They were trying to bully me into signing away my only leverage. Read it carefully, Vanessa chimed in from the sofa, rolling her eyes. Mom and Dad are being incredibly generous. You should be thanking them on your knees for cleaning up your absolute mess. If you sign that waiver, Patricia said, her voice dropping to a smooth, calculated purr, we will immediately unfreeze your personal bank accounts. You will have your miserable $42 back, but we will go one step further. We know you are in trouble, Harper. So, upon the execution of this document, we will grant you a one-time monetary gift. We will write you a cashier's check for exactly $50,000. $50,000! I stared at the crisp white paper in my hands, while a cold, violent fury raged behind my ribs. They had stolen $4.8 million of my grandfather's money. They had bought mansions and luxury yachts and custom Cartier watches. They had let me live in a moldy apartment while taking $2,000 from my own paycheck every single month. And now they were offering me a pathetic $50,000 of my own stolen wealth to permanently buy my silence. They genuinely thought I was stupid enough and desperate enough to take the deal. I did exactly what I had planned to do with Mr. Sterling in the hotel business center. I broke down. I let out a loud, agonizing sob and dropped my face into my hands. I cried loudly and pathetically, allowing my shoulders to heave with manufactured despair. I wept about how tired I was. I wept about how I could not fight them anymore. I babbled incoherently about how I just wanted to pay my rent and get my life back. I put on the performance of a lifetime projecting total and absolute submission. I will sign it. I cried, wiping my eyes with the sleeve of my oversized sweater. I will sign whatever you want. I just cannot live like this anymore. Please just give me the money. The profound relief that washed over my parents' faces was instantly palpable. William sat back in his leather chair and let out a long breath. Patricia smiled a thin, victorious smile. They had won. They had successfully crushed their rebellious daughter and secured their stolen empire. However, I continued sniffing loudly and looking up at them with wide, tear-filled eyes. I want to do this right. I want to prove to you that I am committed to this family. Vanessa, you are hosting your 5th anniversary gala next weekend, right? Vanessa looked at me with immediate suspicion. Yes, I am. What does that have to do with anything? The anniversary gala was the crown jewel of my parents' social calendar. They were funding a massive 200-person black tie event at a historic downtown venue entirely with my stolen money to celebrate Vanessa and Marcus. It was designed to show Chicago high society how incredibly wealthy and successful the Evans family was. I want to sign the papers there, I said, my voice trembling with fake sincerity. I want to do it with our lawyers present before the dinner begins. I want to stand in front of the family and officially apologize to Vanessa for everything I've put her through. I want to show everyone that we are a united front and that I am finally accepting the help I need. I want to be part of the family again. I watched the suggestion land. I knew my parents' psychological profiles perfectly. They were malignant narcissists who fed entirely on public perception and absolute control. The idea of me signing my own defeat while simultaneously offering a public groveling apology at their most highly publicized social event of the decade was a temptation they absolutely could not resist. It appealed to every single sick vanity they possessed. William looked at Patricia. Patricia looked at Vanessa. The sheer arrogance in their eyes completely blinded them to the trap I had just laid wide open at their feet. That is actually a very mature decision, Harper, Patricia said, smoothing her cashmere sweater with a smug look of absolute triumph. A public demonstration of your commitment to recovery is exactly what this family needs to move forward. We will have the legal team present in the private bridal suite before the grand reception begins. You will sign the waiver. We will hand you the check, and you will finally take your rightful place in the background. I nodded meekly, clutching the unsigned document to my chest. Thank you, I whispered. Thank you so much for saving me. I walked out of that massive colonial estate, keeping my head down and my shoulders slumped until I reached the privacy of my battered car. The second the door slammed shut, and I was hidden behind the dense hedges, the tears instantly vanished. I tossed the fraudulent legal waiver onto the passenger seat and started the engine. I did not feel broken. I felt dangerously and radiantly alive. The Trojan horse was officially inside the city gates. While my parents spent the next week gleefully preparing for their massive high society gala, picking out custom floral arrangements and ordering thousands of dollars in imported champagne, Marcus and I were operating a highly covert war room out of the back office of his architectural firm. Marcus was a brilliant African-American man who had built his renowned design firm through sheer talent and 70-hour work weeks. When I had shown him the undeniable proof that Vanessa had forged his signature on a massive secondary mortgage to funnel cash into an offshore account, he had not broken down in tears. He had gone completely clinical. We spent every single night that week executing a flawless financial extraction. Marcus was legally married to Vanessa, but his business was structured under a separate corporate entity. However, the fraudulent secondary mortgage he had taken out using his pristine credit score deeply jeopardized his personal financial standing. If the bank discovered the massive fraud before we controlled the narrative, they could freeze all of his legitimate assets. We had to move faster than the banks and faster than my parents. Using my extensive background as a corporate financial controller, I guided Marcus through a rapid and highly complex asset protection protocol. He completely drained his personal checking and savings accounts, transferring the legitimate funds he had earned into a newly established secure trust account that Vanessa could not trace. He contacted his primary business partners and quietly shifted the operational capital of his architectural firm into a protected escrow account shielding his company payroll from any upcoming federal freezes. He gathered his most important blueprints, his personal documents, and his irreplaceable family heirlooms, and moved them into a secure storage unit on the south side of the city. He packed his bags in the dead of night while Vanessa was deeply asleep in the master bedroom of the mansion my money had bought. Every morning he would wake up, kiss his treacherous wife goodbye, and go to work pretending everything was perfectly normal. He was matching my performance flawlessly. While Marcus secured his life, I was working directly with Mr. Sterling. My grandfather's ruthless estate attorney had completely bypassed the local civil courts. He knew that suing my parents in a standard county jurisdiction would take years of agonizing litigation and endless appeals. But my parents had made a catastrophic jurisdictional error. By wiring $4.8 million from an international trust fund across state lines to capitalize a shell company registered in Delaware, they had not just committed grand larceny. They had committed massive federal wire fraud. Mr. Sterling utilized his extensive network of high-level government contacts to bypass the standard bureaucratic delays. He took the flawless color-coded forensic audit I had created and placed it directly on the desk of a senior director at the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. The IRS does not play games with offshore accounts and massive unreported income. When the federal agents reviewed the clear photographic evidence of Vanny Corp., the forged secondary mortgages, and the blatant tax evasion linked to the hidden yacht, they did not just open an inquiry. They initiated a full-scale criminal raid protocol. I sat in the glass conference room of Mr. Sterling's downtown office on the Thursday before the gala going over the final execution plan. Mr. Sterling was reviewing a stack of federal warrants that had just been signed by a federal judge. "Your parents' legal counsel drafted a very tight fiduciary waiver, Miss Evans," Mr. Sterling said, tapping his expensive pen against the document Patricia had handed me at the intervention. "If you sign this paper in front of witnesses, you effectively immunize them from civil liability regarding the trust mismanagement." "I know," I replied smoothly. "That is why I am not going to sign it." I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a completely identical stack of legal papers. I had spent hours at the firm matching the exact font, the exact margin spacing, and the exact paper weight of my parents' fraudulent waiver. I had recreated the document flawlessly with one massive and catastrophic alteration. I handed the modified packet to Mr. Sterling. He put on his reading glasses and scanned the text. A slow, deeply predatory smile spread across his face. Instead of a waiver absolving them of liability, I had drafted a legally binding acknowledgement of receipt. Hidden deep within the dense legal jargon, where my parents' arrogant attorney would never bother to check, I had embedded a clause, stating that William and Patricia Evans explicitly acknowledged the unauthorized transfer of $4.8 million from the Harper Evans Trust. The document stated that the $50,000 check they were handing me was a direct admission of the remaining stolen balance. By signing this document as witnesses to my signature, they would be legally confessing to the entire federal crime on paper. "You are going to switch the documents at the signing," Mr. Sterling murmured, looking at me with genuine awe. "You are going to make them sign their own federal confession." "They rely entirely on their absolute arrogance," I said, leaning back in my chair. "My mother is so completely certain of her dominance over me that she will not read a single line of that paper. She just wants the physical victory of watching me surrender. I am going to hand her the pen myself." "And the federal agents?" Mr. Sterling asked, looking at his watch. "Marcus has already coordinated the logistics with the venue," I replied. "He is the guest of honor. He controls the security list. He has specifically authorized full building access to the agents under the guise of private event security. They will be waiting in the service corridors, completely out of sight, until the exact moment Marcus hijacks the presentation screen." Mr. Sterling closed his folder and removed his reading glasses. He looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling Chicago skyline. "I have dismantled dozens of hostile estates in my career, Miss Evans," he said quietly. "I have dealt with embezzlers and extortionists and corporate thieves, but I have never seen a financial execution orchestrated with such absolute clinical precision. Your family deeply underestimated you. They thought I was just collateral damage," I said, picking up my modified legal documents and sliding them safely into my briefcase. "They are about to find out that I am the entire consequence." The stage was set. Marcus had successfully protected his architectural firm and hidden his legitimate wealth. Mr. Sterling had secured the federal warrants and mobilized the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. I had weaponized my parents' own hubris against them, drafting a fatal document they would eagerly sign to secure their fake victory. Every single trapwire had been pulled completely taut. We were not just going to embarrass them at a party. We were going to completely obliterate the fraudulent reality they had built on my back. The anniversary gala was designed to be their ultimate triumph, but as I walked out of the law office into the cool Chicago evening, I knew the absolute truth. It was going to be their public execution. Saturday night arrived with a biting chill rolling off Lake Michigan. I pulled my battered 10-year-old sedan into a damp, poorly lit public parking garage located 3 blocks away from the historic downtown venue. My parents had rented the grand ballroom of a legendary luxury hotel for Vanessa and Marcus to celebrate their 5th wedding anniversary. As I walked up to the towering brass doors of the hotel, I watched a continuous and sickening parade of luxury vehicles handing their keys to the valet. Men wearing custom-tailored tuxedos and women draped in heavy diamonds stepped onto the pristine red carpet. Every single detail of this opulent 200-person gala was meticulously designed to broadcast the immense wealth and superior status of the Evans family. As a corporate accountant, I could not help but automatically calculate the massive cost of the surrounding extravagance as I walked through the grand lobby. I looked at the towering floral arrangements of imported white orchids flanking the entrance and immediately priced them at $5,000. I saw the massive hand-carved ice sculptures and the crystal champagne towers and the silver trays of beluga caviar being circulated by a small army of waitstaff and tallied another $30,000. I listened to the live string quartet playing classical music in the corner and added another $5,000 to my mental spreadsheet. My parents were throwing the absolute social event of the entire season, and it was completely funded by the $4.8 million they had ruthlessly drained from my stolen trust fund. I thought about the grueling 60-hour weeks I spent auditing spreadsheets in a windowless office just to afford the $2,000 monthly payments they demanded. I thought about the winter I could not afford to fix the heating in my apartment and slept in my winter coat while they were likely deciding between vintage champagnes for their next country club luncheon. The sheer audacity of their performance was physically sickening, but I knew that any display of anger right now would completely ruin the operation. I was wearing a simple dark blue dress I had bought off a clearance rack 5 years ago. I kept my head down and my shoulders slightly hunched intentionally, playing the role of the broken and defeated daughter they fully expected to see. I stepped into the grand ballroom, and the sheer arrogance of the display almost took my breath away. The elite of Chicago high society filled the massive room. I saw local politicians and wealthy property developers and well-known socialites mingling under the glowing crystal chandeliers. Holding court at the very center of the room were my parents. William was wearing a sharp-tailored tuxedo and a vintage gold Rolex watch. He was holding a glass of expensive scotch and loudly recounting a completely fabricated story about a recent golf trip to Europe. Patricia stood right beside him, wearing a custom emerald green gown that probably cost more than my entire car. She was beaming radiantly and playing the role of the perfect benevolent matriarch to absolute perfection. She laughed at the appropriate moments and graciously accepted endless compliments from her wealthy friends. They looked entirely invincible. They looked like people who had never committed a single financial crime in their entire lives. Then I spotted my sister. Vanessa was standing near the premium open bar, wearing a breathtaking white silk gown that aggressively mirrored a wedding dress. She was parading Marcus around by his arm, treating her brilliant, hardworking African-American husband like a shiny purchased accessory to show off to her friends. Marcus was wearing a classic black tuxedo and holding a glass of sparkling water. If you did not know the truth, you would think he was a happy and devoted husband, celebrating a beautiful milestone with his loving wife. But I knew the absolute truth. I knew he had spent the entire week quietly liquidating his protected assets and packing his bags while Vanessa slept soundly in their stolen mansion. I caught Marcus looking across the crowded room. Our eyes met for a single fraction of a second. His face remained perfectly neutral, but I saw the hardened, dangerous resolve burning right behind his dark eyes. He gave a microscopic nod toward the heavy draped curtains near the kitchen entrance. Standing in the shadows, barely noticeable to the intoxicated and laughing guests, were three men in dark suits. They were not wearing the standard hotel security earpieces. They possessed the rigid, hyper-vigilant posture of federal law enforcement. Mr. Sterling had delivered exactly what he promised. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division was in the building waiting for the signal. The trap was fully armed and ready to snap shut. I moved toward the back of the room, keeping myself deliberately small and isolated near a quiet corner table. I needed my mother to find me looking completely isolated and desperate. It did not take long at all. Within 20 minutes, I felt a sharp, aggressive tapping on my shoulder. I turned around and saw Patricia standing there with a tight, deeply condescending smile plastered across her face. The warm, inviting glow she had just been projecting to her wealthy friends vanished the exact second she looked at me. "It is time, Harper," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper that cut right through the loud music of the string quartet. "Do not make a scene. Follow me quietly right now." I let my eyes widen in manufactured fear. I gave her a small, pathetic nod and clutched my simple black leather portfolio tightly against my chest. Patricia turned and began walking briskly toward a heavy set of double doors located near the catering entrance. I followed her like an obedient prisoner walking directly to the gallows. She pushed open the heavy wooden doors and led me down a quiet, thickly carpeted hallway, far away from the music and the laughter of the gala. The transition from the chaotic joy of the ballroom to the dead silence of the corridor was incredibly jarring. We stopped in front of a private executive lounge. Patricia opened the door and ushered me inside before quickly shutting and securely locking the door behind us. The sudden silence in the room was suffocating. The lounge was dimly lit and smelled strongly of expensive cigar smoke and old leather. Sitting at a heavy mahogany conference table in the center of the room was a man I did not recognize. He was wearing a slick gray suit and possessed the slimy, overly confident demeanor of a lawyer who specialized in making wealthy people's problems permanently disappear. He did not stand up when I walked into the room. He simply tapped a thick stack of legal documents resting on the table in front of him. "Have a seat, Harper," Patricia commanded, pointing a manicured finger to a wooden chair positioned directly across from the lawyer. I sat down slowly, allowing my hands to visibly tremble. I placed my black leather portfolio carefully on my lap. "This is our legal counsel, Mr. Bradley." Patricia continued pacing slowly behind my chair like a predator circling a wounded animal. "He has finalized the fiduciary waiver we discussed at the house. You are going to sign it right now. Once Mr. Bradley notarizes your signature, we will authorize the unfreezing of your meager bank accounts, and I will personally hand you the $50,000 cashier check. You will then return to the ballroom and publicly apologize to your sister during the family toasts. Do you understand me?" I looked down at my hands and forced a single tear to spill over my lower eyelid. "Yes," I whispered, my voice cracking perfectly. "I just want this nightmare to be over. I am so tired." The lawyer slid the document across the polished mahogany table along with a heavy silver fountain pen. Sign the bottom of page 7 and initial the margins of the preceding pages, he instructed in a bored, flat, monotone voice. Patricia leaned down until her face was mere inches from my ear. "Sign it, Harper," she hissed venomously. "Be a good girl for once in your miserable life." I reached out with a shaking hand and took the heavy silver pen. I pulled the legal document toward me. My heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but my mind was completely cold and utterly calculating. I had spent hours practicing this exact physical maneuver in the glass conference room with Mr. Sterling. I knew that deeply arrogant people never pay attention to minor physical details because they are entirely blinded by their own impending victory. I deliberately fumbled the heavy silver pen. I let it slip through my trembling fingers and clatter loudly onto the hardwood floor beneath the table. "Oh, I am so sorry," I stammered, letting out a pathetic little sob. I bent down quickly to retrieve the fallen pen. As my upper body dipped completely below the edge of the mahogany table, entirely breaking their line of sight, I executed the swap. I smoothly slid their fraudulent waiver into the hidden back compartment of my black leather portfolio resting on my lap. In the exact same fluid and silent motion, I pulled out the identical stack of legal papers I had brought with me. It was the document I had flawlessly recreated over the weekend, matching the exact font, the exact margin spacing, and the exact premium paper weight. But this document was not a waiver absolving them of liability. Hidden deep within the dense legal jargon where my parents' arrogant attorney would never bother to check, I had embedded a legally binding acknowledgement of receipt. By signing this document as witnesses to my signature, William and Patricia Evans were explicitly acknowledging the unauthorized transfer of $4.8 million from my trust fund. The document clearly stated that the $50,000 check they were handing me was a direct admission of the remaining stolen balance. They were legally confessing to the entire federal crime on paper. I sat back up and placed the swapped document directly onto the table. My mother rolled her eyes at my apparent clumsiness, completely unaware that I had just handed her a fully loaded weapon. I clicked the silver pen and smoothly signed my name at the very bottom of page 7. I pushed the document across the table toward the lawyer. Attorney Bradley did not even bother to read the pages. He had drafted the original waiver himself and simply assumed this was the exact same file. He was far too arrogant to verify the text. He rapidly stamped his official notary seal on the final page and scribbled his signature. Patricia snatched the document from his hands with a massive, triumphant smirk. She opened her designer clutch and pulled out a certified cashier check for $50,000. She tossed it onto the table in front of me like she was throwing loose change to a beggar. $50,000. To them, it was a cheap bribe to guarantee their permanent immunity. To me, it was the final piece of physical evidence required to execute their absolute ruin. I looked at the crisp paper check and felt a profound sense of closure. This was the last time they would ever hold financial power over me. "It is done," she said, her voice dripping with absolute victory. "Wipe your face, Harper. It is almost time for the toasts. Do not embarrass us out there." I picked up the check and slipped it quietly into my portfolio. I stood up and wiped my eyes carefully. "I will not embarrass you," I said quietly. "I will give you exactly what you deserve." I stepped out of the private executive lounge and walked back down the thickly carpeted hallway toward the grand ballroom. The heavy mahogany doors swung open, and the chaotic symphony of clinking crystal and wealthy laughter washed over me. Patricia glided ahead of me effortlessly, rejoining her circle of socialite friends, as if she had not just attempted to extort and silence her own daughter. I walked over to my quiet corner table and slipped my black leather portfolio onto the chair beside me. My heart was a steady drum against my ribs. I looked across the sprawling room at the 200 guests completely oblivious to the financial slaughter that was about to unfold right in front of them. The glittering chandeliers cast a golden glow over the imported orchids and the towering champagne pyramids. It was a monument to fraud, and the demolition crew was already in the building. A sharp ringing sound cut through the ambient noise of the ballroom. William was standing at the edge of the grand stage, tapping a silver spoon against his champagne flute. The string quartet immediately ceased playing. The wealthy guests turned their attention toward the stage, murmuring appreciatively as my father stepped up to the microphone. He looked out over the crowd with the serene confidence of a man who believed he was utterly untouchable. Thank you all for joining us tonight. He began, his voice echoing richly through the state-of-the-art sound system. We are gathered here to celebrate 5 beautiful years of marriage between my incredible daughter Vanessa and her wonderful husband Marcus. William paused, perfectly timing his delivery for maximum emotional impact. You know, building a legacy is not easy. It takes relentless hard work. It takes sacrifice. But most importantly, it takes absolute family loyalty. We Evans pride ourselves on supporting one another through every hardship and every triumph. We built our success from the ground up through honesty and sheer determination. I stood in the back of the room, gripping the edge of my table so tightly my knuckles turned white. The sheer magnitude of his hypocrisy was physically repulsive. He was standing in front of Chicago high society, lecturing them about honesty and hard work, while standing on a stage entirely paid for with my stolen trust fund. He smiled warmly at Vanessa, who was glowing in the front row. Vanessa, my beautiful girl, you have shown such incredible grace and resilience in building your life. You and Marcus are the perfect testament to what happens when you build a foundation on absolute trust. William raised his glass high in the air. To Vanessa and Marcus, may your foundation remain forever strong. The crowd erupted into enthusiastic applause. Hundreds of crystal flutes were raised in the air. As the applause began to die down, Marcus stood up from his front row seat. He buttoned his classic black tuxedo jacket and walked calmly up the short flight of stairs to the stage. He did not look like a man whose wife had secretly mortgaged his property to fund an offshore account. He looked entirely composed and dangerously sharp. William smiled broadly and handed the microphone over, expecting a groveling speech of gratitude from his son-in-law. Marcus took the microphone and stood at the center of the stage, looking out over the sea of wealthy faces. His dark eyes scanned the room until they briefly locked onto mine in the back corner. The microscopic nod he gave me was the only signal I needed. The countdown had officially reached 0. "Thank you, William Marcus," said his deep voice resonating through the ballroom. "You are absolutely right. A strong marriage and a strong family require a very specific kind of foundation. They require transparency. They require trust. And tonight I want to show all of you the exact foundation my wife and her parents have built for us over the last 5 years. Vanessa beamed from her seat, assuming Marcus had prepared a lavish romantic slideshow. Several guests smiled in anticipation, waiting for the inevitable montage of vacation photos and wedding memories. Marcus reached into his tuxedo pocket and pulled out a small black remote. "I have put together a special presentation to honor this milestone," he continued, his tone dropping to a smooth clinical register. "I think it is incredibly important that everyone in this room sees exactly how the Evans family operates behind closed doors." Marcus pressed the button on the remote. The massive crystal chandeliers hanging from the vaulted ceiling immediately dimmed to a soft amber glow. Behind him, a gigantic high-definition projector screen silently descended from the rafters. The heavy velvet curtains framing the stage pulled back automatically. The projector mounted in the balcony flared to life. A blinding white light hit the massive screen. But the image that appeared was not a romantic photograph of a young couple on a beach. It was a massive, perfectly crisp scan of a legal operating agreement. At the very top in bold black letters was the entity name Vanny Corp. LLC. Below it were the names of the sole managing members: William Evans, Patricia Evans, Vanessa Evans. The room fell into a state of profound and absolute confusion. Guests squinted at the screen, trying to understand why they were looking at corporate registration documents at an anniversary gala. Marcus paced slowly across the stage, keeping his eyes locked on the crowd. "What you are looking at is a domestic shell company," Marcus announced, his voice echoing with terrifying clarity. "For the past 12 years, my father-in-law, my mother-in-law, and my beautiful wife have used this hidden corporate entity to systematically launder stolen money." A collective gasp rippled through the front rows. William took a sudden jerky step forward, his face twisting from confusion into sheer panic. "Marcus, what are you doing?" he hissed, trying to reach for the microphone, but Marcus smoothly pivoted away and pressed the button on his remote again. The massive screen flashed to a new image. It was the color-coded forensic spreadsheet I had meticulously compiled during the night. The columns detailed every single wire transfer over a 12-year period. "Look closely at the screen," Marcus instructed the crowd. You will see a trust fund account listed at the top. This trust fund belongs exclusively to Harper Evans. It contained $5 million. Over the last 12 years, William and Patricia Evans forged their youngest daughter's signature to drain $4.8 million from that account, routing the stolen capital directly into Vanny Corp. The silence in the ballroom became completely suffocating. The air was sucked out of the room as 200 high society guests stared at the undeniable proof of a massive financial crime. Marcus clicked the remote again. Two images appeared side by side. On the left was the official cash purchase agreement for Vanessa's luxury mansion. On the right was a wire transfer receipt from the stolen trust fund, perfectly matching the purchase amount to the very last cent. My wife likes to tell people she bought our home through her successful consulting business. Marcus said, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. The truth is, she bought it using her younger sister's stolen inheritance while letting Harper live in poverty to pay their fake medical bills. The crowd erupted into shocked whispers. People were pointing at the screen and covering their mouths in horror. Patricia let out a strangled shriek from the front row and grabbed the back of a chair to keep from collapsing to the floor. The pristine mask of the perfect matriarch had been violently ripped away, leaving behind a terrified thief caught squarely in the spotlight. But Marcus was not finished. He clicked the remote one final time. The image on the screen shifted to a heavily redacted secondary mortgage application. This one was deeply personal. This is a predatory secondary mortgage taken out against the property we currently reside in. Marcus announced, his voice rising with righteous fury. Look at the signature at the bottom. That is my name. But I never signed this document. My wife Vanessa secretly forged my signature to take out a massive cash loan against my pristine credit. She then transferred those illicit funds directly into a hidden offshore account in the Cayman Islands, completely controlled by her and her parents. She actively tried to bankrupt me to build a secret escape fund. The entire ballroom exploded into total chaos. The refined murmurs of the wealthy elite turned into loud shouts of disbelief and absolute outrage. Business partners who had invested with William were staring at him with pure disgust, realizing they had partnered with a brazen criminal. The elegant string quartet in the corner had completely stopped playing their instruments mid-bow. The musicians sat frozen in their chairs, staring at the massive projector screen in sheer horror. The meticulously curated atmosphere of luxury and prestige was completely annihilated in a matter of seconds. Vanessa finally snapped out of her paralyzed state. The reality of her absolute public destruction hit her like a freight train. She leaped out of her chair, her expensive custom gown tangling around her legs. "Turn it off!" she screamed, her voice cracking into a hysterical, shrill shriek that echoed violently across the massive ballroom. "Turn it off right now!" She scrambled frantically toward the side of the stage, pointing wildly at the technical booth located in the back balcony. Cut the feed. Someone cut the feed right now. The young audio-visual technician sitting in the raised booth frantically slammed his fingers against his computer keyboard, trying to comply with her desperate shrieks. He flipped switches on the massive soundboard and yanked down the master fader, but absolutely nothing happened. The blinding white light of the forged offshore mortgage continued to burn brightly on the massive projector screen for every single guest to witness. Marcus stood at the edge of the stage and looked down at his hyperventilating wife with a cold and ruthless smile. "You cannot turn it off, Vanessa," he said, his voice projecting loud and clear over the ensuing panic. "I overrode the local network and locked the entire visual system from my personal encrypted server 30 minutes before I walked onto this stage. That evidence is staying up there until every single person in this room understands exactly what kind of monsters you really are." Vanessa grabbed the sides of her head and let out a guttural, agonizing wail of pure defeat. William was gripping the edge of the front row table, looking like a man who was about to have a massive heart attack. Patricia was completely frozen, staring blankly at the massive screen as her entire social empire burned completely to ashes right before her eyes. The opulent gala they had funded with my stolen money to celebrate their fake legacy had perfectly transformed into the exact venue of their absolute ruin. The massive projector screen continued to display the undeniable proof of their crimes, casting a harsh white light over the stunned crowd. The absolute silence in the ballroom was finally shattered by the frantic hyperventilating gasps of my mother. I did not stay in the back corner. I walked slowly out of the shadows, I smoothed the front of my simple blue dress and walked down the center aisle of the grand ballroom, passing tables full of Chicago's elite who were staring at me with a mixture of horror and profound fascination. I walked up the short flight of stairs and joined Marcus on the stage. He offered me a small, tight nod and handed me the microphone. I looked out over the sea of faces. I looked directly at my parents. "My name is Harper Evans." I began my voice carrying the absolute weight of a 12-year betrayal. For over a decade, my parents William and Patricia have told everyone in this room that I am a severe, high-functioning gambling addict. They told you they were bankrupting themselves to save my life. They used that disgusting lie to extract $2,000 a month from my own paycheck. I let out a short, humorless laugh that echoed through the room. But as you can clearly see on the screen behind me, there was absolutely no gambling debt. The $4.8 million they funneled out of my grandfather's trust fund was not used for medical rehabilitation. It was used to systematically fund the exact lifestyle they are parading in front of you tonight. They stole my inheritance to buy my sister a luxury mansion. They stole my future to pay off their own residential mortgages. They financially bled me dry to pay the monthly docking fees on a 50-foot luxury yacht, while I lived in an apartment with a leaking roof. I paused, letting the magnitude of the theft truly settle into the minds of their wealthy friends. A woman in the second row audibly gasped and covered her mouth with her hand. And they did not just steal from me. I continued turning my gaze directly to Vanessa, who was currently slumped in her chair, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. My sister Vanessa utilized the exact same shell corporation to secretly take out a highly predatory secondary mortgage on the property she shares with her husband. She blatantly forged Marcus's signature to secure a massive cash loan and routed every single dollar into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. She actively tried to bankrupt an entirely innocent man to build her own secret financial empire in the dark. William suddenly snapped. The public exposure of his crimes, the absolute destruction of his fake prestige completely shattered his fragile narcissistic mind. His face turned a deep mottled purple. He let out a feral roar of pure, unadulterated rage. "You ungrateful, scheming, lying little," he screamed, his voice cracking with absolute fury. He lunged out of his chair, knocking over his crystal champagne flute. He charged directly toward the stage, his hands curled into violent fists. He looked ready to physically tear me apart in front of 200 witnesses. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I stood perfectly still and watched the inevitable consequence of his actions finally catch up to him. Before William could reach the first step of the stage, 3 men in dark suits materialized from the shadows near the catering exit. They moved with terrifying speed and absolute precision. They intercepted my father mid-stride. One agent grabbed his arm and violently twisted it behind his back, driving him face first into a pristine white tablecloth. The second agent immediately secured his other arm, while the third agent stepped in front of the stage, forming an impenetrable physical barrier between my father and me. "William Evans, you are under federal arrest," the lead agent shouted, his voice booming with absolute and terrifying authority. The sound of heavy steel handcuffs clicking shut echoed violently across the silent ballroom. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Patricia let out an ear-piercing shriek of absolute terror. "William!" She screamed, lunging forward, but a fourth agent had already moved in from the side aisles. He smoothly intercepted my mother and efficiently locked a pair of steel cuffs around her expensive wrists. The perfect matriarch was thrashing and sobbing in her custom emerald gown, completely stripped of her fake dignity. The crowd of high society elites completely erupted into total panic. People were pushing back their chairs, desperate to distance themselves from the unfolding criminal arrests. This was no longer just a family scandal. It was a full-scale federal takedown. From the back of the room, Mr. Sterling slowly walked forward. He was flanked by 2 more agents holding thick manila folders. The ruthless estate lawyer looked incredibly satisfied as he approached the front of the stage. He looked down at my parents, who were now securely restrained and being forcibly hauled to their feet. "You should have paid significantly more attention to the jurisdictional boundaries of your theft," William Mr. Sterling said, his voice carrying a smooth, deeply lethal satisfaction. "When you utilized international wire transfers to funnel stolen trust funds across state lines into a Delaware-registered shell company, You escalated a simple civil matter into massive federal wire fraud. The Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division does not take kindly to offshore accounts and systemic tax evasion. My father was completely pale. The violent rage had instantly evaporated, replaced by the stark, horrifying realization that his life was completely over. He was not going to civil court. He was going to federal prison. He looked at me, his eyes wide and completely hollow. "Harper, please," he rasped, his voice trembling. "Please stop this. We are your family. You gave up the right to call yourselves my family." 12 years ago, I replied, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "You made your choice, William. Now you get to experience the absolute consequences." The federal agents firmly grasped their arms and began marching my parents toward the main exit. They were paraded in handcuffs past every single one of their wealthy friends, past the massive floral arrangements, and out the heavy brass doors of the luxury hotel. The absolute silence of the crowd watching their humiliating exit was deafening. Marcus turned his attention back to his wife. Vanessa was still slumped in her chair, hyperventilating so hard she could barely breathe. She was watching her parents being hauled away, realizing that her entire safety net had just been completely obliterated. Marcus slowly descended the stairs of the stage and stopped directly in front of her. He did not look angry. He looked entirely clinical and profoundly detached. He reached inside his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a thick legal envelope. He dropped it casually onto the white tablecloth right in front of her trembling hands. "What is this?" Vanessa choked out, her voice barely a wet whisper. "That is an expedited petition for absolute divorce," Marcus stated, his voice completely flat. "Included in that packet is a comprehensive list of the assets I have already legally shielded from your reach. You will also find an immediate eviction notice for the mansion. Since the property is legally owned by your shell company, and that company is currently subject to massive federal seizure, I highly suggest you pack your bags tonight. You have absolutely nothing left, Vanessa." Vanessa stared at the legal packet as if it were highly radioactive. A fresh wave of agonizing sobs completely overtook her. The golden child who had spent her entire life stepping on my back to elevate herself was now completely alone, totally bankrupt, and entirely publicly humiliated. I watched her cry, and for the first time in my life, I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no guilt, no lingering sense of sibling obligation. The toxic hold my family had over my psychological well-being was finally and permanently broken. I looked at Marcus. He gave me a sharp, respectful nod. We had successfully executed the financial demolition of the decade. We had taken back our lives. The fallout from the anniversary gala was swift, absolute, and utterly brutal. The federal government does not move slowly when they have a perfectly packaged forensic audit handed directly to them, wrapped up with a legally binding confession. Within 48 hours of being paraded out of that luxury hotel in handcuffs, William and Patricia were formally indicted. The list of federal charges brought against them was absolutely staggering. They were facing multiple counts of grand larceny, wire fraud, identity theft, and a myriad of severe tax evasion charges tied directly to their hidden offshore accounts. They desperately tried to hire top-tier defense attorneys to fight the impending storm, but you need clean liquid capital to pay high-profile lawyers. Thanks to the meticulous groundwork, Marcus and Mr. Sterling laid every single account linked to my parents' names or to Vanny Corp. Had been immediately frozen by the federal authorities. They had absolutely nothing left to bargain with. I watched with profound and quiet satisfaction as the house of cards they built on my back completely collapsed under the crushing weight of federal prosecution. The Internal Revenue Service moved in rapidly and began the highly methodical process of seizing their ill-gotten assets. It was incredibly satisfying to witness the systematic dismantling of their fake wealth. The sprawling colonial estate in the northern suburbs was seized and heavily padlocked. Their luxury vehicles were towed away on heavy flatbed trucks in broad daylight, while all of their wealthy country club neighbors watched in sheer shock and whispered behind their hands. And my personal favorite moment of justice was when the massive 50-foot yacht on Lake Michigan was officially confiscated by federal agents right out of its premium slip. It took many long months of intense legal maneuvering led by Mr. Sterling, but eventually all of those seized assets were liquidated at federal auction. The proceeds from those sales, alongside the remaining recovered offshore funds, were slowly and systematically restored to my grandfather's original trust fund. My parents went from pretending to be the untouchable Chicago elite to facing severe federal prison sentences with absolutely nothing left to their names. They tried to contact me a few times from the detention center, leaving pathetic voicemails begging for mercy and begging me to talk to the prosecutors on their behalf. I never answered a single call. I simply deleted the messages and went on with my day. They made their selfish choices for 12 long years. Now they were finally living the consequences of their monumental greed. Vanessa experienced a uniquely agonizing downfall that perfectly mirrored her immense vanity. The golden child who had spent her entire life stepping on my neck to elevate herself suddenly found herself plummeting to the absolute bottom of the social ladder. When Marcus efficiently finalized the expedited divorce and the federal agent seized the mansion she had bought with my stolen money, she was left completely destitute. Her fake consulting business generated zero actual income without the stolen funds propping it up. Her wealthy socialite friends abandoned her the exact second the scandal broke, completely blacklisting her from their exclusive circles and ignoring her frantic calls. With massive legal debts mounting from her direct role in the wire fraud and the forged secondary mortgage, she was forced to face the harsh, unforgiving reality of actual hard work. Today, Vanessa lives in a tiny, cramped studio apartment on the dirty outskirts of the city. It is bitterly ironic that she ended up in exactly the kind of miserable space she once viciously mocked me for living in. She works 50 grueling hours a week folding clothes and stocking heavy shelves at a generic retail store just to make her minimum legal payments and keep the electricity on. There are no more Cartier watches. There are no more custom silk gowns. There are no more fancy brunches. There is just the exhausting daily grind she always thought she was far too superior to ever experience. Sometimes I picture her standing behind a cash register, dealing with angry customers, and I feel absolutely no pity. She built her false royalty by stealing my life, and now she is paying the exact physical and emotional price. Marcus, on the other hand, completely thrived because we had preemptively isolated his legitimate business capital and protected his firm. Before the gala exploded, the federal asset seizures did not touch his architectural company. He successfully navigated the incredibly messy divorce, cutting Vanessa out of his life completely and permanently. He threw himself entirely into his design work. His firm recently landed a massive commercial contract that put him right back on top of the industry. He did not let the horrific betrayal destroy his spirit or his capacity to trust. He used that righteous anger as pure fuel to rebuild his empire stronger than before. Marcus and I share a deeply unique bond, now born out of the absolute fire we walk through together to take down our abusers. We meet for coffee every other Tuesday morning at a quiet cafe downtown. We never talk about my parents or Vanessa anymore. They are irrelevant ghosts. We talk about our growing businesses, our future goals, and the incredible unmatched peace that comes from taking your life back from toxic predators. My relationship with Grandpa Harrison took deliberate time to rebuild. The 12 years of manufactured lies and intense financial manipulation had created a massive emotional chasm between us. But once the truth was entirely exposed and he saw the undeniable depth of their deception, he dedicated himself to making genuine amends. He paid off the remaining balance of my maxed-out credit card immediately, without me ever asking. We started having quiet dinners together every single Sunday. He told me fascinating stories about my late grandmother and the legacy she wanted to leave behind. In return, I told him about my real life, the life my parents had violently hidden from him. He finally saw the real Harper. He did not see the sick, addicted failure my parents had maliciously invented. He saw the strong, highly capable, and fiercely independent woman I had actually become. We finally have the loving, supportive relationship we were robbed of for over a decade, and it is built on absolute truth instead of toxic manipulation. As for me, the complete restoration of my trust fund meant I no longer had to work 60 grueling hours a week at a corporate firm just to survive the crushing fake debt. I finally had the financial freedom to choose my own path and design a life that truly mattered to me. I walked into my senior manager's office, handed in my formal resignation, and walked out into the bright Chicago sunshine, feeling lighter and more powerful than I ever had in my entire existence. But I did not stop being an accountant. I knew exactly what it felt like to be financially abused in the dark. I knew the exact suffocating terror of having the people closest to you weaponize money to keep you trapped, silenced, and completely paralyzed. I took a portion of the recovered funds and opened my own independent forensic accounting firm downtown. My agency specializes exclusively in helping vulnerable women uncover hidden assets, track offshore accounts, and expose severe financial abuse within their marriages and families. I use the exact same analytical skills I used to dismantle my parents' fraudulent empire to help other victims find their literal freedom. I sit across the heavy oak desk from women who look just as broken, terrified, and exhausted as I once did. I listen to their stories. I follow the paper trails their husbands or families thought were completely invisible, and then I hand them the flawless, undeniable financial proof they need to take their power back and walk away with what is rightfully theirs. I turn the deepest trauma of my entire life into a highly effective weapon for justice. I am no longer the victim of a fake narrative. I am the architect of my own absolute independence. If you are watching this, and you have ever felt trapped by a family that only values what they can violently extract from you, I want you to know that you are not crazy. Financial abuse is very real, and setting hard, non-negotiable boundaries to protect your life is not an act of betrayal. It is an act of pure survival. You do not owe your future, your sanity, or your bank account to people who try to destroy you in the dark while pretending to love you in the light. You have the absolute right to walk away and build a fortress of your own. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this story. If my journey resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so we can continue to grow this community. I would love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let me know exactly what city you are watching from and what time it is right now. Remember, you hold the master keys to your own life. Never let anyone take them away. For 30 years, I believed that family was defined by sacrifice. I was completely conditioned to think that love was a transactional currency I had to constantly earn through my own pain and submission. I genuinely believed that if I just gave enough of myself, if I stayed quiet enough in the background, and if I bled enough for their benefit, they would eventually wake up one day and decide to love me. I thought that by fulfilling their relentless expectations, I was proving my loyalty and securing my rightful place at their table. Society pushes this deeply flawed narrative that blood ties are an absolute and unbreakable bond. We are told from a young age to honor our parents and forgive our siblings no matter how terribly they treat us behind closed doors. We are fed toxic platitudes about how family is everything, and how you only get one mother and one father, so you must endure whatever they dish out. For 3 decades, I swallowed that narrative completely. I let it dictate my choices, my career, and my self-worth. I thought I was simply being the good daughter, the responsible sister, the reliable foundation that kept everything from falling apart. I never realized that I was actually just the designated foundation for them to wipe their dirty shoes on. It took standing in a cold, moldy apartment with $42 to my name and frozen bank accounts to finally see the truth. I was never a beloved family member to them. I was a highly convenient resource, designed solely to feed their endless parasitic greed. The hardest part of waking up from a lifetime of family abuse is the overwhelming grief that immediately follows the anger. It is a very specific kind of mourning. You are not mourning the people themselves because the people you thought they were never actually existed. You are mourning the illusion. You are grieving the childhood you were violently robbed of and the massive amount of energy you wasted trying to prove your worth to people fundamentally incapable of recognizing it. But once you push through that initial heavy grief, you are left with something incredibly powerful. You are left with clarity. I realized that blood does not make a family. Blood is simply a biological coincidence. True family is entirely defined by mutual respect, by absolute safety, and by consistent actions that uplift you rather than tear you down. Love is not supposed to leave you financially ruined, emotionally drained, and constantly questioning your own sanity. When a limb becomes severely infected and threatens to poison your entire body, a doctor does not ask you to simply forgive the infection. They do not tell you to keep the rotting limb attached out of a sense of misplaced loyalty. They tell you to completely amputate the source of the poison before it kills you. Healing a toxic family wound requires that exact same level of drastic surgical intervention. You cannot possibly heal in the exact same toxic environment that is actively making you sick. You have to cut them off, sever the ties, remove their access to your life, and walk away without a single ounce of guilt. People will actively try to make you feel guilty for walking away. Relatives who quietly enabled the abuse will suddenly demand that you keep the peace. Society will whisper that you are being far too harsh or entirely too unforgiving. Do not listen to them for a single second. The people who are most upset by your boundaries are the exact same people who heavily benefited from you having none. Setting firm, hard boundaries is not an act of betrayal against your family. It is an act of profound and necessary loyalty to yourself. Protecting your peace, your finances, and your mental health is never a crime. It is your absolute fundamental right as a living human being. When I stood on that stage and watched federal agents place my parents in handcuffs, I did not feel like a villain. I felt like a woman who had finally learned how to be her own fierce protector. I learned that you cannot rescue people who are actively trying to drown you. You have to let go of their hands and swim to the surface so you can finally breathe. Today, I am no longer the terrified scapegoat cowering in the shadows of a narcissistic sister and abusive parents. I successfully reclaimed my narrative, and I completely rewrote my entire destiny. If you are watching this video and you have ever been the designated scapegoat in your own family, I am speaking directly to you right now. If you have ever had to fight back against the exact people who were supposed to protect you and love you unconditionally, I want you to know that I completely see you. I deeply understand the isolating pain you have carried for so long. You are not crazy. You are not too sensitive, and you are certainly not a burden. I want to hear your stories today. I want to build a community of survivors who have successfully broken the chains of toxic family dynamics. Drop a comment down below right now. Tell me exactly where you are watching from and what time it is there. I want to know how far this message is reaching. But most importantly, tell me how you finally took your power back. Tell me about the moment you decided that you were worth saving. Your story has immense power, and sharing it might be the exact lifeline someone else desperately needs to hear today. Do not forget to hit that like button to help push this video out to other people who might be trapped in the dark. Subscribe to the channel and turn on all notifications for more stories about absolute justice being served. Until next time, remember this one absolute truth. You write your own ending. Take care of yourselves.